It's August 6th, 2024. Two Russian Ki-52 helicopters are scrambled to repel the Ukrainian cross-border operation of unknown scale.
Ястреб, это борт 32. Мы с 45-м на рубеже обнаружили бронегруппу севернее Суджи, 2 километра вдоль трассы. Визуально 2 танка направо. Подтверждаете цель?
Борт 32. Цель подтверждена. Работайте попарно.
Борт 45, я беру левый. Пуск 1. Принял. Забираю правый. Захват. Пуск. Техника поражена, уходим по маршруту Север-3.
Helicopters quickly locate and destroy two tanks, which were still on tank transporters near the city of Sudzha. Satisfied with the outcome of their strike, the crews veer off into horizon, unaware that they had just obliterated the only Russian armor sent to hold the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk in its tracks. Whenever it comes to discussing the Kursk Offensive, most accounts begin with how exactly Ukrainian forces crossed the border on August 6, 2024. As much as we want to get to that, we must first turn to operation almost no one heard of, codenamed Seka. Operation Seka began on July 27, 2024, with a single objective: to prevent Russian forces from discovering when and where Ukraine would launch its next major offensive. At least 4 Ukrainian psychological and information warfare centers, reporting directly to the Unified Special Operations Command under Brigadier General Alexander Trapak, began meticulously simulating heightened military activity in the Kharkiv region, where Russia had launched its own offensive back in May 2024. Ukrainian operatives used mobile speaker systems to broadcast the sounds of heavy equipment movement at night, transmitted false information over unprotected mobile networks, and deployed radio emitters to mimic various military signals. They also scattered decoy equipment across the landscape to conceal the actual redeployment of the 80th Air Assault Brigade to the border, an operation that, if detected, could have alerted the Russians to the imminent offensive. A narrative was introduced claiming that the 88th Mechanized Brigade had already been training there for months. This unit, like the 13th Yager Brigade, never existed. Ukrainian forces had simply simulated their activity on the border for months to obscure the timing and the scale of real build-up. The deception was so effective that the Chief of Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, dismissed all intelligence reports warning of a possible Ukrainian advance from the Sumy region, and instead redirected his attention towards Kharkiv. All these efforts carried out under the first phase of Operation Seka secured for Ukrainian forces the element of surprise, without which none of what followed on August 6th would have been possible. The same can be said about the author of the operation. In 2024, Alexander Syrskyi, known as the man behind Ukraine's lightning offensive in the Kharkiv region in 2022 and defense of Kyiv, replaced Valery Zaluzhny as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. One of the reasons for that was clearly an unsuccessful 2023 southern counteroffensive, which we covered together with all other above-mentioned operations in our previous videos. Syrskyi stepped into the role when the brutal battles grinding on in Donbas didn't just continue, they escalated. Despite suffering staggering losses, the adversary pushed forward, tree line by tree line. After one of the last pre-2022 strongholds, Avdiivka was lost. With Pokrovsk now under threat, Russian troops weren't just tearing through Ukrainian defensive lines, they were also significantly eroding morale. In May 2024, they even opened a new mini-front line, starting an ultimately unsuccessful offensive in the Kharkiv region, which yet further reinforced the widely accepted idea that Ukraine, unlike Russia, is unable to take back initiative and advance. Syrskyi's first and foremost goal was to prove everyone wrong in this regard. He began preparations for a new advance in March 2024 by analyzing what had gone wrong with the previous summer offensive. Undeniably, the biggest issue was the location of the attack, likely the most heavily reinforced sector of the front line in the Zaporizhzhia region. For the new operation, Syrskyi ultimately concluded that the static nature of front line in Ukraine allowed only limited gains at high cost. Therefore, the strike would need to be aimed directly at Russian territory. Second, operational security must be at the highest level, meaning that everyone from most of Ukraine's general staff to all Ukrainian allies should remain completely unaware of the operation's existence or any other details. Third, the execution of such risky plan can be only entrusted to the most experienced and mobile Ukrainian units, which will receive the best drone, air defense and aviation support. Therefore, Syrskyi forms the spearhead of the attack out of the 80th, 82nd and 95th Air Assault Brigades, which are secretly deployed to the Sumy region for the initial breakthrough. These are reinforced by the 33rd and 225th Assault Battalions, Syrskyi's experimental units designed for aggressive attacks, as well as more conventional 22nd, 61st and 116th Mechanized Brigades, 2 reconnaissance and 1 artillery battalion, the 8th Special Operations Regiment, the 5th Omega Special Operations Detachment, SBU Alpha Group, 2 newly formed Special Purpose Regiments of Rangers, along with a few extra battalions and TDF brigades. Altogether, this brings the total force to somewhere between 10 and 15,000 men, as many units mentioned are not deployed in full force due to continuing combat in other parts of the country. Drone support is provided by the 14th UAV Regiment, Flying Skull, Project M2, Requiem Group, and Horn Group UAV units. In June, the Ukrainians also formed the 49th Separate Assault Engineering Brigade, specifically for breaching heavy fortifications, along with the already existing 48th Engineering Brigade and 808th Support Brigade, again keeping in mind the previous offensive, which was stalled by minefields and other defenses. Despite the fact that the border between Ukraine's Sumy region and Russia's Kursk region is chosen due to relatively light fortifications, crossing it is by no means easy. The Russians have thoroughly mined it, set up multiple observation checkpoints, dug anti-tank ditches, laid lines of dragon's teeth, and established regular drone patrols and camera posts. Between 5 and 15 kilometers from the border lies the main Russian defensive line, protecting the sizable city of Sudzha, the administrative center of Sudzhansky district. More importantly, however, is the question who is defending it. Around Sudzha, the Russians have concentrated the 308th and 488th regiments, each fielding 2 battalions, mostly deployed along the main rear defenses alongside local OMON units, a special police branch of the National Guard of Russia. Closer to the border, alongside border guards and conscripts, is the 1434th Motor Rifle Regiment Ahmad. To the south, the same regiment also holds large parts of the border, supported by the 13th Tank Regiment, FSB Special Operations Center operatives, and the same border guard and conscripts formations. Another unusual unit, thinly spread across the area, is so-called VKS Motor Rifle Regiment, composed of personnel from the Russian Aerospace Forces. Various engineers, mechanics and flying staff who are now used as an assault infantry due to shortage of manpower. To sum things up, Alexander Syrskyi, just as he did in 2022, has identified a stretch of the front line defended by relatively few adversary units, and notably commanded by the notorious Alexander Lapin. Despite this, Russian advantages remain in place in form of the landmines, fortifications, air power and artillery, including elements of the 236th Artillery Brigade and the 275th Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment. Though stretched thin across the region, these units still field 13 MLRS systems, 98 artillery pieces and 71 mortars. On top of that are FPV drone crews, now operating brand new fiber optic drones, immune to signal jamming or interference from obstacles. So, the Ukrainians are under no illusion that the operation will be easy. Yet, after Syrskyi personally visits most of the units and explains how different their mission will be from all previous operations, the soldiers are determined to bring the war back to Russia by punching through its weakest spot. The first ones to cross the border at the beginning of August are Special Operations Forces. They infiltrate covertly and demine narrow pathways, as well as do the final assessment of the Russian fortifications and patrols. This information is crucial for further attacks. On August 3rd, 3 days before the incursion, elements of the 80th Air Assault Brigade covertly infiltrate the border up to 500 meters deep. The soldiers cross in the groups of 6 to 8 people with 2 special operations operatives leading each group through already demined pathways, in this way covertly concentrating up to 70 soldiers behind enemy lines for sabotage and reconnaissance. On August 6th, the main operation begins in the early morning. Ukrainians launch coordinated drone and artillery strikes, while the armor of the 80th Air Assault Brigade, with a new triangular tactical symbol, rapidly breaches the Sudzha border checkpoint. Under relentless tank and artillery fire, the entire Russian garrison at this checkpoint surrenders. Photos soon emerge of a fully Russian platoon walking towards Ukrainian border with raised hands. The first visible sign that something significant is underway. However, Ukrainian forces strictly adhere to orders limiting the release of footage, so apart from Ukrainian high command and Russian troops under direct attack, few realize that a major new offensive has begun. This is not a coincidence, but a second phase of Operation Seka, as Ukrainian psychological information warfare centers carefully highlight Russian missteps but leave a lot of room for confusion and speculation by controlling what footage is released. They also place emphasis on the huge number of conscripts that are captured, immediately forcing Russia to ask for renewal of prisoner swaps, as well as destroy the reputation of praised Chechen fighters. Major General Abtialo-Udinov, commander of the various Chechen Ahmad formations in the area, quite literally plays alone, publicly claiming that the border remains secure while quietly withdrawing his forces to the second defensive line. These actions further ruin the cohesion of defenses and result in even more losses. East of Nikolaevo-Dargino, Ukrainian engineering units equipped with UR-77, American M58 Myclics, Vincent 1 MCs and Biber bridge layers from the 48th, 49th Engineering and 808th Support Brigades actively carve paths through the Russian defenses. The armor of the 225th Assault Battalion is the first to push through these breaches. They are immediately followed by the mobile striker APCs and MRAPs of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade and the 22nd Mechanized Brigade. While the 82nd spearheads towards Zelený Shlyakh, the 22nd and 225th systematically clear Russian positions in and around Nikolaevo-Dargino and Dargino. Using forest cover to their advantage, Ukrainian tanks eliminate enemy dugouts, while infantry are dropped by Humvees behind Russian fortifications, taking prisoners in the process. Simultaneously, Ukrainian forces begin breaching the border near Gordievka and south of Oleshnya, forcing the adversary to stretch its forces even further. The Russian response, while quick, is disorganized. Russian FPVs and Lancets focus on the immediate incursion zone, unaware that Ukrainian forces are already advancing deep into the Russian territory with minimal resistance. The Kremlin downplays the situation too, describing the offensive as a minor sabotage operation that was already contained, further adding to the confusion. As border troops surrender or flee, among them a significant portion of the supposedly elite 1434th Motor Rifle Regiment Ahmad, Russian aviation is the first to meaningfully engage. However, as during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Ukrainian advances are so rapid that it's impossible to properly target the airstrikes. As a result, Russian attack aircraft drop munitions indiscriminately, dealing minimal damage to Ukrainian troops. Helicopters like the K-52s and Mi-28s are supposed to be more effective in these circumstances, but they also fail to land effective hits. In a landmark moment, one Mi-28N is shot down by Ukrainian FPV drone, marking the first recorded instance of this type of engagement in this war. In a more conventional manner, using manpads, Ukrainians also shot down one K-52 helicopter. Ironically, the only confirmed achievement of the Russian army aviation on August 6th is the destruction of two of its own T-80 BVM tanks, highlighted in the beginning of this video. With their defenses visibly collapsing and panic spreading, the Russian command turns to the last resort measures. Iskander ballistic missiles are fired in a desperate attempt to hit Ukrainian columns. One strike near Zelený Shlyakh manages to target the column, causing some damage which yet hardly stops the advance. Another strike using two more missiles destroys a single Buk SAM system near the border. These disproportionately expensive and poorly targeted attacks, firing 9 million worth of ballistic missiles at individual vehicles, underscore the Russian leadership's desire to maintain the illusion of control, rather than mount an effective response to the unfolding breakthrough. On August 7th, the 82nd Air Assault Brigade has already crossed the main Russian defensive line, wreaking havoc behind enemy lines. The 225th Assault Battalion catches up with it, while its positions are taken over by forces of the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade, with the support from the Georgian Legion. Elements of the 22nd Mechanized Brigade are swiftly redeployed to the eastern flank of the breakthrough. At the same time, the 80th Air Assault Brigade pushes towards Sudzha. Ukrainian forces also cross the border, south of Oleshnya, with the elements of the 116th Mechanized Brigade, encircling the village. Here, the breakthrough is not easy, as Ukrainians take some losses, but eventually pathways for vehicles are demined and cleared. Similar to the 82nd, the 80th Air Assault Brigade surges forward, smashing through the Russian main line of defense and entering Sudzha from the west. Its advance is well coordinated with the other two brigades to the north and south, allowing Ukrainian forces to approach the key city from three directions. While the 22nd Mechanized Brigade ties down Russians in Kazachya Loknya, the 116th advances through the fields and approaches Sudzha from the south. The Russian city garrison, completely disorganized and under relentless attacks from multiple sides, retreats in disarray to the eastern part of the city. Meanwhile, the 82nd Brigade, advancing near Novoivanovka, splits its forces and pushes both to the east and west. Near Malaya Lognia, they continue to catch Russians by surprise and destroy them, but the attack on Korenevo is thwarted. This is due to the Russian reinforcements, an additional battalion of VKS Motor Rifle Regiment, deployed just in time to repel the determined but not numerous Ukrainian assault. Despite that, Ukrainian forces in many places reached the road between Sudzha and Korenevo, effectively joining multiple breakthroughs into a single salient. Russians continue wasting Iskander ballistic missiles, trying to hit advancing columns, but achieve only misses after misses. Landsat drones are much more successful in hitting Ukrainian vehicles, but they are mostly used near the border and not at the spearheads of the Ukrainian attack, indicating that the Russians still lack situational awareness. Another sign of that is the Chief of General Staff of Russia, Valery Gerasimov, reporting to Putin and the public that the Ukrainian advance has been completely stopped. This statement is not going to age well.
Ударами авиации, ракетных войск и огнем артиллерии продвижение противника вглубь территории на Курском направлении остановлено. В настоящее время подразделения группировки «Север» совместно с пограничными органами ФСБ России продолжают уничтожать противника в районах, непосредственно примыкающих к российско-украинской границе.
On August 8th, the 22nd Mechanized Brigade crosses the river near Sudzha and catches up with previously routed elements of the 488th Motor Rifle Regiment, forcing them to retreat back to the eastern part of the city. Now in control of the main supply line to Sudzha, Ukrainian forces capture most of the city, with only a small contingent of defenders encircled behind the river. The Ukrainian plan to swiftly cut through the Russian defensive line and seize the main part of Sudzha worked perfectly, but the key question now is, what's next? Apparently, Syrskyi understands that the forces under his command are not just fighting the Russians, they are racing against time. The enemy will inevitably raise its situational awareness and bring numerous reinforcements, which will soon curb the lightning-fast Ukrainian advance. Before that happens, Ukrainians must secure as many favorable positions as possible. Anchoring their defenses on two major cities, Sudzha and Korenevo, both situated next to rivers that serve as natural defensive barriers, appears to be the next logical goal. Accordingly, the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade and the Georgian Legion begin their advance westwards, reaching Snagast. A portion of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade initiates a second assault on Korenevo. Although they manage to gain foothold on the city's outskirts, the advance halts due to the size of urban area and the arrival of reinforcements. Here, Ukrainians simply lack the manpower to replicate the skillful encirclement seen in western Sudzha, and as a result, Korenevo remains under Russian control. Meanwhile, another element of the 82nd Brigade advances east of Korenevo, reaching as far as Kromsky Byki. Following the fall of western Sudzha, the 80th Air Assault Brigade, supported by auxiliary units, advances along the main road, reaching as far as Bolshoye Soldatskoye. There, they encounter Russian reinforcements and are forced to regroup to Martinovka after intense combat. Despite this first sharp check, Russians are still unable to effectively blunt Ukrainian mechanized assaults with their own armor. Most of the footage of arriving reinforcements show more Lov vans than tanks and BMPs. One of the first, if not the very first, Russian units redeployed to Kursk from Donbas is the ex-DPR 15th Spyatnazhka Brigade. However, this rapid redeployment is marked by the usual Russian recklessness, leading to the catastrophic losses. During the night between August 8th and 9th, drones of the Horn Group spot the Russian convoy near Orilsk, and Ukrainian forces immediately strike it with HIMARS. As a result, 8 trucks full of Russian soldiers are destroyed before even reaching the front line. By some accounts, the losses constitute at least one whole battalion of troops. On August 9th, a significant number of armored vehicles, currently in rather short supply, arrived to Bolshoye Soldatskoye and Belitsa. Exactly from Belitsa, Russians launched their first full-fledged counterattack. The road leading towards Sudzha had previously been remotely mined by Ukrainian drones, but the charges were set to activate after 48 hours, meaning that by August 9th, they had effectively expired, reopening the route. An additional attack on Martinovka is easily repelled by Ukrainian paratroopers. However, while they're engaged there, the southern flank begins to falter as Russian columns enter Goncharovka and nearly succeed in deblocking the Sudzha garrison. This success proves short-lived. Ukrainian forces quickly redeploy elements of the 61st Mechanized Brigade to the area, retake Goncharovka and rout the Russian attackers. The road is mined again to prevent further breakthroughs, and a significant portion of the 61st Brigade remains in place to secure this flank of Sudzha. Meanwhile, Ukrainian assaults on Korenevo failed to achieve results. Russian forces continued to hold the central part of the city, along with key bridges, preventing an easy encirclement. Overall, the battles in the Kursk region show that Ukrainian forces have succeeded in establishing solid positions in most of the areas they infiltrated. However, Russian forces are also clearly stepping up their efforts, eager to mitigate the humiliation of being invaded after 2.5 years of attempting to conquer Ukraine. On August 10th, Russia redeploys the 810th Marine Brigade from Donbas in full force to the southeastern part of the salient. However, instead of trying to cut Ukrainian forces off from the border, they now concentrate on pushing them back in the area of Martinovka. Meanwhile, Ukrainians are conducting assaults on Kruglik. The clashes in both villages are brutal, though the Russians are using fewer vehicles in an attempt to avoid losing their limited and valuable equipment. Fierce fighting also erupts around Plekhovo, where Ukrainians have quickly secured the western bank of the Psel River and are now working to ensure that the repeat of yesterday's flank attack on Sudzha does not occur. The assaults here are supported by Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, which face Russian colleagues, in particular from Elite Senior Special Forces Center. The situation around Korenevo remains largely unchanged, despite reinforcements arriving from the fraction of the 22nd Mechanized Brigade. The rest of the brigade continues to defend Martinovka, while the fresh forces of the 95th Air Assault Brigade are deployed to the area of Malaya Loknya and Pogrebki. Ukrainian paratroopers clash with 9th Regiment of 18th Motor Rifle Division, which is half encircled in town since the beginning of Incursion, and is eventually completely wiped out. There, they also managed to shoot down Russian K-52 helicopter using manpads. Overall, the effectiveness of Russian aviation and helicopters remains low, even after the front line has begun to stabilize. There is almost no evidence of successful strikes, except for the following case. In this footage, we can see how the Russian K-52 uses 2 laser beam riding anti-tank Viher missiles to accurately take out 2 trucks on the road. This is an impressive result and a great demonstration of the modern attack helicopter capabilities. The only problem is that these 2 trucks were taken out earlier by the drones of the 225th Assault Regiment and abandoned. And yes, these 2 belong to Russians, who hastily retreated to Korenevo in the first 2 days of the Kursk Offensive. In contrast, multiple videos show Ukrainians successfully evacuating damaged equipment, signaling that their logistics are holding firm despite the drone-heavy battlefield. This is no accident. Nearby, the newly expanded 170th Logistics Regiment, formerly a battalion and now a key part of the Air Assault Corps, is actively supporting the operation. On August 11th, the focus remains on Martinovka, where Russian Marines relentlessly attack positions held by the 22nd Mechanized Brigade. The village changes hands multiple times throughout the day, with Ukrainians ultimately prevailing despite coming close to being cut off in nearby Kruglik. Multiple sources also report that Ukrainian forces cross the border near Gopterevka. However, given the complete absence of photographic or video evidence of such breakthrough, this too was likely a psychological operation intended to divert Russian attention. Meanwhile, Ukrainians attempt to encircle Korenevo with a flanking maneuver by mobile units of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. This, however, brings little improvement to the situation, as Russian forces continue to hold the key ground in the city. The VKS Motor Rifle Regiment here is reinforced by the elements of 810th Marine and 128th Motor Rifle Brigades. Russian attempts to strike the Ukrainian salient from the north, in the direction of Malaya Loknya, with combined forces of 11th Air Assault and 810th Marine Brigade, are inconclusive. This is likely due to at least a fraction of 80th Air Assault Brigade being redeployed here from the area of Sudzha sometime before this moment, which in turn allowed to free up elements of 82nd Air Assault for attacks north of Korenevo. On August 12th, Ukrainians finally break the resistance of the 810th Marine Brigade in Martinovka, routing them and capturing Mikhailovka. They continue advancing along the road from Sudzha, now facing the 217th Air Assault Regiment. However, more significant events unfold further south. Elements of the Ukrainian 92nd Assault Brigade are redeployed here to make a breakthrough on BTR force, pushing straight towards Giryi. The plan appears to have been a surprise attack on Russian reinforcements gathering in Belitsa. Even though the column of at least 6 BTR force initially went unnoticed while traveling 20 kilometers, Russian drone operators eventually spot them near Giryi. There, BTRs are ambushed by Akhmat Special Forces and make a decision to regroup and set up an ambush themselves. Judging by the attempt to hide BTRs in Giryi's forest, the plan was to attack Russian forces when they are scrambled to mitigate a breakthrough. However, once spotted, the Ukrainian armor platoon faces a brand new Russian weapon. fiber optic FPVs. Developed shortly before the Kursk incursion, these drones, unlike regular FPVs, cannot be jammed and offer far superior image resolution. A swarm of these FPVs attack the BTR force, destroying 4 vehicles with precise strikes on vulnerable spots. This occurs simultaneously with BTRs engaging Russian reinforcements rushing to the village. One additional BTR-4 is destroyed by the autocannon of the Russian BTR-82, and another is captured intact, bringing total losses to 6. For Ukraine, this represents one of the largest one-time vehicle losses in the operation. Thanks to the armor, most occupants survived, but the Giri assault marks the turning point. It becomes clear that fiber optic FPVs are a formidable advancement, and they will play a significant role in how events will unfold on this front line in the future. On the western flank of the salient, elements of the Russian 810th Marine Brigade are now seen in Kremennoye, significantly reducing Ukraine's chances of enveloping Korenivo. Instead, focus likely shifts to Snagast, south of major city. The Ukrainian HIMARS systems also begin targeting the bridge in Glushkovo, since collapsing it will significantly degrade logistics for the Russians here. Besides bridges, GMLRS rockets are also used for counter-battery fire and destroying command posts, significantly reducing Russian capabilities to counterattack. After the first week of offensive has passed, we can draw the first conclusions and infer what is the goal of the operation. First of all, Ukraine has managed to capture around 1,000 square kilometers of land and 74 settlements inside the Kursk region in 1 week. This far surpasses not only modest Russian gains in the Kharkiv offensive in the last 3 months, but also months' worth of Russian gains in Donbas. What Ukraine demonstrated is nearly perfect blitzkrieg, deemed impossible in the drone era. All is due to careful analysis of past mistakes, new approaches to the operational secrecy, logistics, demining, as well as careful choice of a place of advance. Ukraine has also managed to capture hundreds of prisoners of war, with estimates reaching as far as 800 men. These include around 250 conscripts that are not supposed to participate in active combat, as well as Chechens, who, you guessed it, are also not supposed to participate in active combat, so these categories are extremely valuable for the further prisoner exchanges. Many speculate that the purpose of the operation was to capture Kursk nuclear power plant, the city of Kursk, or at least reach Rilsk. The first hypothesis is even supported by the Russian Ministry of Defense, which officially claims that Ukrainians plan to blow up the power plant after the capture. The credibility of this statement, however, is undermined not only by reputation of Russian Ministry of Defense, but even by the fact that on the map they made, half of the Ukrainian units are placed in wrong places. Even a non-existent 88th Mechanized Brigade that in reality was 80th Air Assault is present. It's true that we don't know the real goals of the Ukrainian command, but claims about plans to capture specifically Kursk, Kursk nuclear power plant or Rilsk are not supported by any evidence at all. Judging by modest forces involved and multiple multilateral attacks, we inferred that the plan was to capture as much Russian land as possible, take foothold in some solid strong points such as Sudzha and Korenivo, as well as local high grounds, and force Russians to pull forces from Donbas to fight an uphill battle on their own land. Among additional benefits of the offensive, there is a significant morale boost, further escalation that should speed up approval of strikes on Russian land by Western long-range weapons, as well as prisoners of war that can be exchanged. Other speculations look more like intentionally setting an unachievable in current circumstances goal for the offensive to declare it failure as fast as possible. Coming back to the battlefield, on August 13th, Ukrainians continue attempts to cross the Krepna river near Korenivo, but apparently these attacks are curbed by the abundance of drones. Korenivo is also reinforced with elements of the 98th Air Assault Division, which was stationed nearby before the incursion, including the drone unit Bobor. Across the salient, Russians capture a few Ukrainian damaged vehicles, which indicates that these were abandoned likely in an attempt to consolidate positions. Both Russian and Ukrainian aviation continue to conduct airstrikes, while both sides try to fortify their new front line. Colonel General Alexei Dumin is appointed as the head of the Russian operations in the Kursk region. Being Putin's assistant, he never participated in any major military matters, usually serving in administrative roles, which rather shows that Lapin will continue his destructive command, while Dumin will just serve as a conduit of information to Putin. On August 14th, 14 operatives from the Ukraine's SBU Alpha group captured another 100 Russian soldiers, mainly from 488th Regiment and the 204th Specialized Regiment Akhmat, inside the network of fortifications in Gordievka. Meanwhile, elements of the same unit fled or surrendered en masse in the encircled eastern sector of Sudzha. With this, it's now clear that Ukrainian forces have secured full control of the city. These repeated surrenders show that despite deploying various reinforcements to the region, Russian forces lack effective coordination with isolated garrisons left behind as Ukraine advanced. Hidden in elaborate fortifications, both elite and regular Russian troops have been effectively cut off and abandoned. Ukrainian troops typically give them a chance to surrender. If they refuse, a few grenades finish the job. The soldiers of the Ukrainian column of BTR force that was destroyed in Girie were not routed and took the foothold in Kamyshinoye, where they engaged in brutal combat with Russians. Some gains are also made around Sudzha, which further allows the city to turn into an anchor of defense and logistical hub, despite the arrival here of the 15th and 200th motor rifle brigades. The advance also continues to the south of Snagast. Ukrainians again target Russian logistics by seriously damaging the bridge in Glushkovo with HIMARS rockets. The still present degree of confusion about who holds what positions allows Ukrainian Special Operations Forces to continue acting in an intended manner. They actively infiltrate Russian lines and make ambushes, increasing adversary losses despite frontline stabilization. Of course, it's only relatively stable, but still doesn't look like one in Donbas, where industrial cities and fortifications force things to resemble World War I. In Kursk, Ukrainians, just like Russians, still make raids, using a less urbanized environment and forests for maneuvers. However, these become progressively more and more risky, which is illustrated by both Russian and Ukrainian ambushes on each other's vehicles. This also means that any maps, including our one, can hardly reflect to the fullest extent the real state of combat. Thus, it should be viewed with a pinch of salt, as it only reflects the area Ukrainians control with the highest probability, and doesn't show each and every raid and contested territory for obvious reasons. On August 16th, all eyes continue to be on the western part of the salient. Here, the same river works as a solid defensive line, but also creates a few bottlenecks in logistics. For this reason, Russians start retreating from the western part of Tyotkino, blowing up the bridge. However, this is not enough. Ukrainian aviation conducts a precise airstrike with guided bombs on a damaged bridge near Glushkovo, finally collapsing it. The Russians quickly start establishing a pontoon bridge to the east of the destroyed one. Ukrainians meanwhile conduct an airstrike on the bridge in Zvanoye, heavily damaging it. Overall, Ukrainian aviation starts conducting more airstrikes on Russian territory with guided munitions such as French Hammer bombs, American GBU-39s, and JDAMs that are more effective against bridges than GMLRS HIMARS rockets. On August 17th, Russians continue to use Iskander ballistic missiles, targeting HIMARS and M270 MLRS long-range systems. While one HIMARS was indeed taken out in Sumy region, judging by the secondary detonation of munitions filmed by the reconnaissance drone, in the second strike, Russians actually destroyed an inflatable decoy instead of the real vehicle. The concentration of many such decoys near Kharkiv already helped to divert Russian attention prior to the Kursk incursion, and now the placement of many such decoys in the Sumy region quite effectively wastes Russian high-precision weapons. This, however, does not mean Ukrainians suffer no losses due to Russian strikes. The drones put strain on logistics and also curb many Ukrainian tactical attacks, resulting in an extremely rare situation where Ukraine ends up losing more equipment than the adversary. From the Russian side, mostly infantry assaults continue across the whole front line, especially in the area of Malaya Loknya. There, 95th Air Assault Brigade consistently repels Russian attacks and regularly counterattacks. On August 18th, Russian forces on the southern bank of Same River apparently start feeling the pressure of closing Ukrainian troops, who capture Snagast. They, first and foremost, prioritize the immediate evacuation of phones and other possessions of value from Glushkova stores, apparently to prevent a possible capture by the enemy. Jokes aside, the acts of pillaging by Russian forces in the Kursk region are not different from those seen in Ukraine, so we will mention them just once. The same is true for a long list of war crimes, which will become progressively more common in a few months and will mostly manifest themselves in executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war, especially by Russian Marines. Some elements of them, in the form of the fraction of 155th Marine Brigade, are deployed here as well. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian command too carefully continues to deploy scarce reserves to gain just a little bit more land. Here, the 501st Separate Marine Battalion captures Apanasovka, further creating pressure on the Russian forces on the southern bank of the same river. On August 19th, the third and last bridge across the same river is heavily damaged by Ukrainian aviation. In addition to that, with Marines now supporting the advance, the area of control is expanded into Vishnyovka. This way, the area south of same river is further isolated and is supplied only with pontoon bridges. Moreover, they still act as logistical bottlenecks, which allow Ukrainians to quite effectively catch multiple pieces of Russian equipment there, and destroy them with FPV drones and GMLRS rockets. Ukrainian airstrikes reach not only river crossings, but also Russian command posts in the eastern part of Tyotkino and Glushkovo. On August 20th, Ukrainians reached the same river by capturing Krasnooktyabrskoye and consolidate their positions to the south. Near Korenevo, Ukrainians still firmly hold the outer perimeter of the city, but are likely expecting the counterattacks by the garrison. This is why they start thoroughly mining the streets with drones, and this has certain effect. In a video published by Russians, 2 vehicles in a column are destroyed by something that was claimed to be a new, precise Russian bomb capable of tracking moving targets. The other video, however, shows that one of the vehicles is a low van in Russian-controlled area, so the column in fact was not Ukrainian and simply hit landmines planted by drones. To the west, Ukrainians continue airstrikes on Russian positions near the heavily damaged bridge in Zvanoye. Even redeployment of the elements of the 5th Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade here does not help. It's also a good time to revisit the northern and eastern parts of the salient. There, throughout a week of active combat, Ukrainians have managed to secure quite a few positions, now not just contesting but controlling a significant salient towards Kauchuk and engaging in heavy combat inside the village itself. A few active advances towards Nechayev also create tough conditions for the elements of the 810th Marine Brigade, who quite successfully tied Ukrainians in combat in Malaya Lokny, but are now close to being encircled. The front line to the east of Sudzha continues to resemble a stable arc from Martinovka to Borky. Russians conducted multiple assaults on the Martinovka, but Ukrainians have managed to repel them all and even counterattack, entering Russkaya Konopelka. The heavy combat there is apparently confusing not only for spectators, but also for participants. In the town engulfed in flames, Ukrainian forces clash with Russian paratroopers of the 11th Air Assault Brigade and other auxiliary forces in brutal urban combat. Ukrainian Cossack MRAPs and M113 APC are seen delivering infantry that takes a foothold in the town. Suddenly, the Russian BMP-3 appears out of the smoke and splits Ukrainian forces. It first tries to destroy M113 that hastily retreats, but misses every shot. After that, the Russian BMP-3 turns around to take out the Ukrainian Cossack 7 MRAP that is similar to the M113, simply has no weapons capable of penetrating the Russian vehicle. However, the Russian BMP-1, which also suddenly appears on the intersection, also tries to destroy the Ukrainian MRAP, approaching it from the left side. The driver of the MRAP starts quickly reversing as it has nothing else to do. Suddenly, the Russian BMP-3 opens fire at the MRAP despite the friendly BMP-1 blocking the side, tearing the friendly vehicle apart. Looking at how violently BMP-3 destroyed that BMP-1, it seems like it was misidentified by the crew as an enemy since the BMP-1 appeared from nowhere and stayed perpendicular to BMP-3 without showing the big V symbol in front. The unexpected combat between 2 Russian BMPs allowed the Ukrainian MRAP to escape for now, and its crew is dropped off at nearby houses. The vehicle itself is later destroyed by drones, same as 2 other Cossack 7 MRAPs that entered the town, but infantry was successfully delivered to positions, with Ukrainians losing only 1 man killed and 1 wounded according to the footage. This engagement highlights how chaotic urban combat, especially involving multiple vehicles, can be. Moreover, since drones are the primary weapon used to destroy an equipment, the engagement described above can indicate that crews simply are losing skills associated with vehicle-to-vehicle engagements. At this point, there are quite literally thousands of drone strikes for every pure vehicle duel. By August 21st, to the south, Ukrainians also capture Kolmakov and Panaseyevka. Even near Korenevo, they achieve important gains by taking back Kremennoye. This is possible due to the 810th Marine Brigade shifting its focus to Kauchuk, where their quite ambitious counterattack ends in disaster. The Marines are encircled and suffer heavy casualties. Overall, the Ukrainians revitalized the offensive to some extent, despite numerous Russian reinforcements, drones and aviation. Working in tight coordination with artillery units armed with HIMARS and M270 MLRS, the Ukrainian 8th Special Operations Regiment locates the Russian river crossings around Glushkovo. First, operatives employ FPV drones to take out exposed engineering equipment. Then, the crossings are hit with regular GMLRS rockets that destroy the bridges. Finally, the cluster GMLRS rockets are used to finish off infantry, completing the task of cutting off Russian logistics again. Despite such textbook operations, Russians continue to build bridges right under the strikes to persistently maintain at least some logistics across the river, despite losing men and equipment. On August 22nd, Ukrainians capture Komarovka, continuing pressure on Glushkovo. The way of Ukrainian troops here is consistently cleared by aviation, which continues to target not only bridges, but major Russian fortifications and strong points, such as 1 and 2 Muzhitsa. Russians, meanwhile, push the adversary out of Nechaev with forces of the newly arrived Arbat battalion and bring the 2nd Spetsnaz brigade to the eastern flank of the salient. Despite these reinforcements, it's fair to say that both Russians and Ukrainians are running low on reserves to achieve new breakthroughs. This, however, does not mean that forces are even somewhat equal, as the Russian grouping of forces north numbers around 70,000 men, which are split between the static and deprioritized Kharkiv front line and Kursk Incursion area. Even very rough estimates indicate that against approximately 10 to 20,000 Ukrainians, here Russians concentrate somewhere between 30 and 50,000 of theirs, by far not the worst troops. Surprisingly, in terms of equipment, which Ukrainians were losing quite actively due to drones and need to advance, there is certain parity with Russians, who suffered enormous material losses in the past years of conflict. As of now, Ukrainians in absolute terms have lost more in the course of incursion, but this is soon going to change. Since August 23rd, the battles continue but do not bring either side much territorial gains. While Ukrainians are likely again forced to retreat from Kremennoye, the 225th Separate Assault Battalion advances to the north of the village, crossing the river and capturing a number of Russians in the area of Durovka. Some evidence suggests that Ukrainian troops are present even further to the north and are blocking the railroad that leads to Korenyo after taking a foothold on the northern bank of the Krepna River and on the outskirts of Alexandrovka. This, however, does not degrade the Russian logistics much, as the main supply routes enter the town from the west and the complex terrain with rivers prevent any possibility of fast encirclement. As we have seen, the rivers are not much of an obstacle for Russians, and they have plenty of pontoon bridge layers and quite skilled combat engineers who yet take massive losses from time to time. For example, on August 28th, the Ukrainian 8th Special Operations Regiment again locates and destroys 6 pontoon bridge layers in just one spot near the front line. The already assembled pontoon bridge is also destroyed in the area of Zvanne by HIMARS using intelligence provided by the 14th UAV Regiment. By the end of month, Ukrainians also reclaim some positions around Cherkasskaya Porechnoye and again take a foothold in Nechaev. Russians redeploy to Kursk a few extra units including Veterane Assault Brigade. This is the latest out of the whole list of units such as Arbat Battalion, 1428th Regiment, Petnashka and 11th Air Assault Brigades that were removed from the hottest Pokrovsk direction to mitigate a Kursk incursion. While this is not enough to immediately halt the Russian advance there, Ukrainian soldiers note a certain relief compared to earlier months of battles. On September 1st, Ukrainians somewhat improved their positions near Malaya Loknya due to prior advances to the east and west in the area. The newly formed 152nd Yagor Brigade is deployed closer to the salient, but it's not enough to significantly affect the situation where both sides consolidated positions and arranged solid drone reconnaissance that prevents any deep breakthroughs. Around September 4th, Ukrainians start to realize that with current forces, even a partially cut-off Glushkovo area is impossible to take. Nevertheless, by September 9th, the last bridge in this area near the town of Kharkiv is destroyed by Ukrainian JDAM-ER glide bombs. On September 10th, the 14th UAV Regiment splits up as a separate 413th Unmanned System Battalion is formed. One of the first targets of the new unit is a rare Russian remote mining system, Zemlyedelye in Glushkovo, which is destroyed in cooperation with the newly arrived 78th Airborne Assault Regiment on September 12th by directing a HIMARS strike. The 14th UAV Regiment also continues work providing information and showing HIMARS strikes with cluster GMLRS rockets on Russians near the various river crossings. As a month has passed since the beginning of the operation, both sides are further fortifying their positions, fully embracing static warfare, just in the other sectors. Overall, a relatively small Ukrainian grouping continues to tie down a Russian force several times of its size. Now on the defensive, Ukrainians are, as elsewhere, focused on maximizing adversaries' losses. Meanwhile, the Russian command is likely facing increasing pressure from political leadership to bring an end to what they had previously characterized as a minor raid by sabotage and reconnaissance groups. This leads to a gradual intensification of brutal assaults, carried out with a little regard for losses. These efforts are clearly visible as Russians begin attacking in large mechanized columns, something not seen since the Battle of Avdiivka. This shift indicates that Kursk front now receives priority equal to or even greater than the Pokrovsk area, as Russia now commits the modest remains of its equipment to reclaim its own territory. As a result, since early September, the previously unfavorable ratio of equipment losses for Ukraine begins to shift closer to 1-to-1, and as we began this story with Operation Seka, it makes sense to finish this chapter by coming back to it, following phases 1 and 2, diverting Russian attention prior to the attack and concealing the scale of the offensive as long as possible. Ukrainians move into phase 3. Since August 15th, Ukraine has established the military commandant's office of the Kursk region, headed by Major General Eduard Moskalyov. This office oversees execution of plans devised by Ukrainian psychological and informational warfare centers to build communication channels with local civilians. This includes first and foremost thousands of Russian citizens receiving the means necessary to continue their lives in areas now under Ukrainian control. This often overlooked effort has led to the complete absence of civilian resistance or partisan activity, in stark contrast to 2022, when Russia's invasion of the Sumy region nearby triggered widespread sabotage and the destruction of hundreds of vehicles by local partisans. No such movement have emerged in Kursk. Furthermore, international journalists have been granted access to the area, and this reporting has consistently reflected an atmosphere of relative calm and coexistence between local civilians and Ukrainian forces who continue their operations along the entire salient. Coming back to the battlefield, on September 9th, Russians gather a long column of vehicles, mostly tanks and BMDs, of the 51st Air Assault Regiment of newly arrived 106th Air Assault Division. The column cuts through Ukrainian positions and quite surprisingly reaches Snagost and then disperses right behind Ukrainian lines. While on march, Russian forces met minimal resistance, likely due to a combination of factors like proper jamming and well-executed reconnaissance, as well as lack of Ukrainian forces in the area. The auxiliary assaults by the forces of 155th Marine Brigade also likely helped to distract Ukrainian forces of the 103rd TDF Brigade and expose their flank. By some accounts, Russian Marines here, similar to other forces deployed to Kursk, are also reinforced by former servicemen of Wagner Group, which used to form PMC's professional corps. By September 11th, it becomes clear that the raid swept Ukrainians from a number of villages south of Korenevo and reopened the land corridor to Glushkovo, as Russians sent more reinforcements into created wedge near Snagost. Together with that, the paratroopers start assaults on Lyubimovka. This attack is yet another evidence that the western flank of the salient, without control over Korenevo, is one of the few weak spots Ukrainians have, but they can do little to change that at this point. Russians also understand that, beginning a rapid build-up of forces, with the final goal to concentrate most of their VDV and Marines here to replicate the success near Snagost on larger scale. The Ukrainians answer with their own flank attack, striking in the area of Vesolo and Menvezhye. This operation is executed mostly by elements of the swiftly redeployed 225th Assault Battalion, with the support from the elements of the newly arrived 21st Mechanized and 95th Air Assault Brigades. The Assault Battalion provides drone support with Horn Group unit, as well as clears border fortifications. After that, fresh forces of the 21st Brigade on Leopard 2s and CV-90s surge forward, facing significant resistance, but a kin of Russians try to disperse behind enemy lines. Without reaching significant territorial gains, the Ukrainian forces still divert attention of the portion of 51st Air Assault Regiment that was storming Lyubimovka, halting the Russian advance there. Paratroopers still enter the village, but are not capable of advancing as fast as few days ago. They also sustain heavy casualties, as the area around Lyubimovka quickly turns into the graveyard of the Russian vehicles. Just from September 11th to 14th, here, Russians lost at least 5 BMDs. It's also important to note that these vehicles are notorious for their lack of armor and easily ignitable ammunition, which explains why almost any hit results in catastrophic detonation. Head-on assaults on BMDs, therefore, show the urgency with which Russians try to push Ukrainians out, as well as highlight the inevitable shift to borderline suicidal assaults, which remain the only tactic Russians employ to achieve territorial gains in absence of obvious cracks in defenses, such as one in Snagost. By September 15th, they also intensify attacks in the eastern part of the salient, taking Borki village with the combined forces of the 810th Marine Brigade, as well as Sarmat and Arbat battalions. Russian drone strikes also become more and more common across the salient, keeping Ukrainian vehicle losses way higher than the Russian ones. Despite that, from September 15th to 25th, no other breakthroughs were achieved, as the situation more or less hangs in balance again. Ukrainian command, and likely Syrskyi himself, as the author of the operation, faced a dilemma. It's quite obvious that without reinforcements, the weak western flank will soon continue to crumble, since losses mount for both sides, but the Russians simply renew them faster despite losing more in countless assaults. The deployment of the fresh 21st Brigade showed that introducing more forces for sure helps to slow down the adversary, but this means weakening other parts of the front line. Syrskyi ultimately decides to continue reinforcing the Kursk area, bringing the elements of the 1st and 17th Tank and 41st Mechanized Brigades into action throughout the first half of October. Ukrainians also continue striking pontoon bridges across the same river, keeping Russian logistics on the western flank under pressure. Since such targets can usually be hit effectively with HIMARS rockets, Ukrainian aviation, armed with high-precision bombs, shifts its focus towards Russian positions in Vysolo. This support allows troops to finally secure a foothold in the village by the end of the month, though the 21st Brigade and auxiliary forces suffer significant losses in scarce western equipment during the fighting. Without an element of surprise and with little cover, Ukrainian mechanized columns faced swarms of Russian drones that destroyed up to 10 CV-90s and 1 Leopard 2. It's worth noting, however, that unlike assaults involving BMDs, such attacks on these western vehicles have a significantly higher survival rate for soldiers due to their superior design. This is evident not only from the fact that most of the destroyed vehicles were abandoned by their crews and remained in one piece, but also from the footage showing CV-90s and Leopard 2s, specifically the Swedish Stridsvagn 122 variant, operating after sustaining FPV drone strikes. In one example, this type of Ukrainian tank is seen evacuating a damaged T-72 across the border, while its own turret burns following the Russian strike. To the east, the Ukrainian positions are reinforced by elements of the 101st and 129th CDF brigades, including the elite 253rd Assault Battalion RA. Russians at the same time reinforce the area of Korenevo with the whole 106th Airborne Division, deploying 119th and 137th Airborne Regiments, in addition to already present 51st, on this narrow part of the front line. This is nothing but a preparation for the next wave of attacks, akin to those conducted by the 51st Airborne Regiment, but on larger scale. Backed up by the 234th Air Assault Regiment from the 76th Air Assault Division and 56th Air Assault Regiment from the 7th Air Assault Division, the Korenevo grouping represents one of the largest concentrations of elite VDV forces since the battle for Kyiv. The word elite, however, applies only to a certain portion of it, because for a while, even the best Russian units internally separated into a small portion of valuable and competent specialists, had a much more numerous expendable fraction that is meant for one-way assaults, often but not always referred to as Storm V, though VDV regiments apparently still maintain a slightly larger fraction of elite specialists than other motor rifle or tank units. Since October 1st, Russians begin a new wave of mechanized and infantry assaults on Ukrainian positions around Korenevo. Now, they attack with replenished marine brigades, mostly used as expendable troops, and only afterwards try to target weak spots with VDV forces. The attacks are directed not only towards Zeleny Shlyakh, but also from the north, with elements of the 810th Marine Brigade, and in the Vysolo area. For 10 days, Ukrainians successfully repel most of the attacks, but pressure mounts. The Ukrainian command swiftly redeploys the experienced 47th Mechanized Brigade with its M1 Abrams and M2 Bradleys, as well as full 36th Marine Brigade to the salient, but it's too late. On October 10th, the Russians finally locate and punch through a weak spot in the area of Lyubimovka and advance into Novoivanovka. Despite the road from Snagas to Zeleny Shlyakh becoming one of the first so-called roads of death in the Kursk region due to a huge amount of destroyed Russian vehicles littering it, the success is significant. Ukrainians were taken by surprise on many positions, which caused an incident where 9 drone operators were captured by soldiers of the Russian 155th Marine Brigade and executed. Facing prospects of being cut out in a narrow corridor that is constantly assaulted from all sides, Ukrainians begin the withdrawal of troops from Korenevo outskirts. This way, by October 13th, Ukrainians retreat from Olgovka and Kremennoe, avoiding the encirclement. Together with that, Russians, who paid for another quick leap forward, with hundreds of men and dozens of pieces of equipment, are forced to slow down. The number of aggressive assaults in the area of Pogrebki from October 10th to 16th, which were meant to cut off the Ukrainian salient towards Korenevo completely, apparently failed due to extremely poor planning. In one video, we can see the BTR-82, likely of the 810th Marine Brigade, that simply drives towards two Ukrainian T-64BVs head-on. The first tank reacts quickly to the threat, and once BTR approaches, makes a shot at point-blank range. The high explosive shell tears apart the thinly armored hull and launches the turret of the vehicle upwards. A few crew members miraculously survive and surrender. Afterwards, the BTR is shot again, this time with an armor-piercing shell by the second T-64BV, to make sure that it's not going anywhere. To be fair, one of the T-64BVs that repelled the reckless attack of the Russian BTR-82 is later destroyed by an FPV drone, after it was stuck and abandoned by the crew at exactly the same spot. To be double fair, behind the forest, along which two Ukrainian T-64BVs moved, the whole graveyard of tightly packed BTR-82s form, as a result of astonishingly bloody and completely pointless assaults here. One of these was also recorded, featuring how three Russian BTRs approached the above-mentioned forest, apparently held by Ukrainian troops, drop off infantry in the open field, and retreat. The troops, apparently under fire, immediately panic and also retreat in complete disarray, taking heavy casualties and demonstrating a practically non-existent level of planning and coordination among Russian seemingly elite marines. Such attacks by the 810th Marine Brigade are repeated until most of their BTRs are lost near that forest. However, the main focus of the Russian command apparently remains on reaching Malaya Loknia to drive an even deeper wedge in Ukrainian-held territory. At this point, the 155th Marine Brigade finds itself partially encircled from the three sides and under drone onslaught, losing dozens of vehicles to push forward. On October 18th, the Russians conduct mechanized assaults along the key road from Novoivanovka to Malaya Loknia, but consistently hit drone-dropped landmines, forming yet another road of death. One of the lucky BTRs that reaches closest to the village is finished off by a Ukrainian tank defending the area. Overall, from October 1st to 20th, in this area, Russians lost over 50 armored vehicles, and apparently hundreds if not thousands of men belonging to 155th Marine Brigade, that is close to being completely annihilated in combat again by combined efforts of the elements of the 36th Marine, 47th Mechanized, 82nd and 95th Air Assault Brigades. This is partially seen as a revenge for multiple war crimes the brigade committed, but much more important is that its role as a ram, which pushed through Ukrainian positions despite unthinkable losses, is almost over. This is not the first instance of heavy losses in the 155th Marine Brigade, as it was already practically destroyed and routed near Kyiv, then Vuhledar, and finally near Novomykhailivka, repeating the same catastrophic mistakes over and over. In conclusion, the recent bloody assaults allowed Russians to reduce the area controlled by Ukraine from 1300 at its peak to approximately 700 square kilometers, by twice exploiting weak spots in defenses that emerged after dozens of very costly and fruitless assaults. To repeat this pattern, Russians obviously need to quickly regenerate an expendable fraction of their forces, and here they find help from abroad. North Korea, which recently became a key Russian supplier of millions of artillery shells and hundreds of ballistic missiles, also sends its troops to help. For the first time, these soldiers are spotted on training grounds on October 18th, using mostly Russian equipment. In total, the plan is to receive 12,000 men from North Korea as reinforcements for their grouping of forces north, which will become the first direct participation of a third country in the conflict since its beginning. The specific forces Kim Jong-un sends are hard to identify, but they are collectively referred to as 11th Corps, which includes at least elements of 92nd and 94th Special Operations Brigades. In reality, however, its second name, the Storm Corps, better reflects its nature of being a unit of mostly assault infantry without much mechanized assets. While Koreans are still going through the training, though, we have to mention that despite recent setbacks, Ukrainians still lose positions mostly on western flank, while attacks happen pretty much everywhere. This is because on the eastern and southeastern parts of the salient, Russians amassed mostly motor rifle units, which are replenished with men and equipment way slower than seemingly elite VDV and Marines, concentrated to the west. On October 20th, Ukrainians also shoot down an Orion medium-altitude attack drone, even though it is the 9th destroyed UAV of this type. Out of a few dozen Russians produced, this incident is significant. Orions, together with Forpost UAVs, were actively used in the Kursk region since the very beginning due to a lack of Ukrainian mid-range air defenses, and were responsible for destroying at least a few dozen Ukrainian pieces of equipment with their own miniature missiles. Called HBPLA, these munitions trace origins to Cornet ATGMs, so they combine high accuracy and penetration. Even though the quantity of drones did not allow Russians to curb the initial breakthrough, medium-altitude attack UAVs still inflict losses higher than the much more numerous Russian helicopters that were mostly busy lobbing unguided rockets in highly inaccurate pitch-up attacks after performing a few high-precision friendly fires we covered earlier. In contrast, Ukrainian aviation showed something that can be without exaggeration called resurrection during the Kursk Offensive. While the first F-16s were only arriving in August 2024, Ukrainian old MiG-29s and Su-27s were actively supporting the Ukrainian offensive as never before. The secret lies in adaptation of Western weapons for Soviet airframes, which required years of work but clearly paid off. French hammer bombs, American GBU-39s, and JDAMs all add high-precision strike capability that allows Ukrainian aviation to attack high-value targets with something heavier than HIMARS rockets. As we discussed earlier, this allows Ukrainians not only quite easily collapse bridges used for logistics, but also increase pressure on enemy forward positions. The Russians are also using their OMPK glide bombs in Kursk, but those are significantly less precise, even though they still allow Russian aviation to stay mostly out of range of Ukrainian air defenses. Meanwhile, their own surface-to-air missile systems are being successfully destroyed in large numbers by various Ukrainian drones. Therefore, Ukrainians and Russians reach similar effectiveness in the air, but in two different ways, indicating a significant catch-up Ukraine Air Force made since the last offensive, where this activity was fairly low. Another aspect of the air war over the Kursk region is the use of anti-air interceptor drones, a technology Ukraine has pioneered. We have already covered how this became a new threat to Russian helicopters, but as of October, they also play a significant role in taking down Russian attack drones, primarily Lancets, as well as a variety of fixed-wing reconnaissance drones. Coming back to the ground, by October 21st, Ukrainians launched a counterattack and stabilized the situation around Zelenyy Shlyakh, sweeping Russians away from many positions, with well-coordinated assaults executed by elements of the 36th Marine, 47th Mechanized, 82nd and 95th Air Assault Brigades. On the Russian side, the 1434th Akhmat Chechnya Regiment is urgently redeployed here to support the virtually destroyed 155th Marine Brigade. That starts losing positions it captured a few weeks ago by paying enormous price in men and equipment. On October 22nd, Russians also start pushing from the eastern flank, approaching Martinovka with combined forces of 11th and 83rd Air Assault Brigades. At this point, more than half of all Russian VDV units were redeployed to Kursk, which hints that the Ukrainian official goal of diverting Russian forces is undeniably achieved, even though there will be a significant lag between redeployment and slowdown in combat on the other critical parts of the front line, such as Pokrovsk. By the end of the month, Russians again go into replenishment mode and have to accumulate men and equipment for the next leap forward. It's important to mention that combat, especially around Zelenyy Shlyakh, does not stop for a day, but during this time is characterized by Russians just using and losing less equipment and troops, gaining virtually no ground. They are once again signifying the terrible state of the notorious 155th Marine Brigade. The positions are reinforced by the 137th Airborne Regiment and 83rd Air Assault Brigade. After this partial redeployment of the 225th Assault Battalion and 95th Air Assault Brigade to the area of Zelenyy Shlyakh, the Ukrainian advances near Veselye also halt. Seeing no further chance to cut off this area, Ukrainians make decision to retreat, especially as the 21st Mechanized Brigade suffered heavy losses in men and equipment due to activity of Russian fiber optic FPVs, the timely redeployment of VDV forces, and overall poor operational planning. However, since forces are tired in heavy combat, the elements of the 47th Mechanized Brigade were redeployed here as well to cover the withdrawal. Despite Bradleys and Abrams tanks being actively targeted by drones and ATGMs, they successfully evacuated friendly forces across the border after conducting bold raids on a number of Russian positions and suppressing them with fire. On November 2nd, Russians intensify attacks from the north, with still more or less battle-capable and replenished 810th Marine Brigade. They again probe Ukrainian positions, vastly outnumbering the enemy, and seemingly find the right weak spot. Unable to take Malaya Loknya from the western flank, they decide to strike it from the north, moving along the river, which conveniently splits Ukrainian defenses. On November 7th, Russians launch a new major offensive, now trying to reach Malaya Loknya from the north with swift mechanized assaults. Over a dozen of thin-armored BTR-82s of the 810th Marine Brigade depart from Novoselovka in a large column. The vehicles reach Novaya Sorochina, but there is a caveat. At this point, the Ukrainian drones and landmines already destroyed 11 BTR-82s along the road, completely shattering Russian plans by wiping out the whole attack force. Auxiliary strikes from the west also fail, concluding one of the bloodiest and largest mechanized assaults in a long time. The reasons why this attack failed range from absence of proper reconnaissance to the fact that the area was timely reinforced by the 95th Air Assault Brigade, whose positions were earlier taken as the 17th Tank Brigade. It's also clear that 810th Marine Brigade repeats the fate of 155th, executing borderline suicidal orders of the higher command. Both eastern and western flanks, which Russians also constantly probe, Ukrainians meanwhile reinforced with the 4th and 6th Rangers regiments, which were recently created to bridge gap between Special Operations Forces and regular mechanized troops. On the next day, the Russian command again throws forces of the 810th Marine Brigade towards Pogrebki, which causes more losses and even fewer territorial gains than the day before. At the same time, the Russian 83rd Air Assault Brigade begins assaults in the area of Daryino with mixed results. PDV forces suffer heavy losses in BMDs and troops, but using numerical advantage push Ukrainians back. Around Zelený Shlyakh, Russians have no progress and only losses. On November 11th, the 155th Brigade briefly comes back to the front line here, just to repeat the brutal mechanized assaults. What's interesting is that past losses likely forced it to use in head-on assaults combination of BMPs and MTLBs instead of BTR-82s, and the least trained soldiers, causing catastrophic losses again. In quite an ironic incident, Russian Marines even drowned 2 of their BMP-3s with extra armor and flags in the river near Novoivanovka. On November 12th, the attacks are repeated again, but what's interesting is that 155th and 810th Marine Brigades start actively using Akhmat MRAPs instead of BTR-82s that took heavy losses before. Overall, however, columns become smaller and are burned down entirely in the process of attacks by the new Special Operations drone unit in the area called Faust, as well as Birds of Magyar and UAV companies of local brigades. Combined efforts allow Ukrainians to destroy up to a dozen armored vehicles daily, just on the western flank of the salient according to the footage. One of the assaults is particularly interesting because it happens not far away from the forest, where a Ukrainian tank destroyed a Russian BTR at point-blank range. In one of the videos, the 8th Special Operations Regiment shows how 4 Akhmat MRAPs are taken out one by FPVs. Another interesting detail is that on the same intersection, a month ago, Russians abandoned 2 BTR-82s, and since then they have not evacuated them. This once again shows how drones are capable of basically isolating parts of the battlefield. Eventually, these 2 are destroyed, bringing the Russian vehicle losses on this small intersection to 6 in a single day. However, we picked this assault for a more detailed breakdown also because there is a video of the area from the Russians. It was filmed in February 2025 and shows what the rollers of death created by drones look like. Once again, we can pretty much see all the damaged equipment left in the fields, indicating a lack of any efforts to evacuate it. Moreover, 4 more vehicles were destroyed here as well. This is if we don't count WAZ-452 Lov and civilian cars. Note that this is considered an average Russian assault vehicle graveyard, as roads near Zelený Shlyakh are filled with destroyed equipment even more densely, which we will show later. This footage is the best evidence of the remarkable incompetence of the Russian command, and shows exactly how the Kursk Offensive forced them to pull equipment needed everywhere on the front line to defend Russia itself with rather questionable effectiveness. November 13th becomes the last day of something that could be called massive mechanized assaults in this area. The Russian 155th and 810th Marine Brigades effectively destroyed themselves against Ukrainian defenses and drones with no significant territorial gains. Quite numerous VDV units were more careful and sustained significant but not yet catastrophic losses, but most of their assaults were also pointless, effectively taking back only one village. In conclusion, the third Russian offensive wave in the Kursk region ends in complete disaster. From November 7th to 14th, in just 1 week, Russians lost 72 pieces of equipment, according to photographic evidence. This is just on the western flank of the Kursk salient, or roughly 25 kilometers of the front line. For the same area and time span, Ukrainians lost 4. Such Russian vehicle losses were unseen since the Battle of Avdiivka, where mindless assaults of huge columns were mostly happening in the area of villages of Stepova and Krasnogorivka. It was widely accepted that the Russians would no longer waste so much equipment due to looming shortage, but the Kursk Offensive forced the Russian command to totally rewrite their plans. It's also worth discussing why. War in Ukraine since the very first day has been a multidimensional conflict with particularly important details extending beyond maps. For example, Ukraine as well as Russia significantly rely on their allies, or at least partners, since the conflict became a multi-year war of attrition. Therefore, maintaining an extended military and financial aid, or undermining the support provided to the opponent are the things that directly shape the battlefield. With the United States being one of key donors of military equipment for Ukraine, it's plausible that one of the many goals of Kursk Offensive was to show to whoever wins presidential elections on November 5, 2024, that Ukraine, while undeniably being on back foot, carries potential to shape the conflict the way it wants, and generally speaking is not a lost cause. Subsequently, the goal of Russia was to convince the next US administration in the opposite. Thus, it makes sense to link the unusually heavy use of armor in assaults, which is harmful strategically but can be beneficial tactically, to the Russian plans to deal with incursion by the time of the elections, or at least by the end of November. Some sources suggest that the first deadlines set up by Kremlin for the military command expired in October, but these are mostly unsupported claims. In any case, the three major waves of Russian attacks in Kursk reduced the area of control by Ukrainians roughly by half, but they are nowhere near the end goal of the completely pushing an adversary behind the border. Moreover, mindlessly throwing poorly protected armor against drones and landmines once again proved to be a recipe for mass casualties. With most of the storage bases more than half empty at this point, destroying hundreds of pieces of Russian equipment, urgently pulled out of reserves inside Russia, is yet another overlooked achievement of the Kursk incursion. Coming back to the battlefield itself, as of November 15th, the Russian efforts to advance on the western flank of the salient, especially near Dar'yino and Zelený Shlях, continue to result in equipment and man losses, but no breakthroughs are achieved. Russian columns usually pile up at some bottlenecks, stopped by landmines and eventually finished off by drones. This happens day after day without much change, which shows the level of disregard of the local Russian command for their own soldiers, comparable to the one demonstrated in battles for Vuhledar. On November 17th, the White House grants permission to use ATACMS ballistic missiles against targets on Russian land. This decision also extends to Franco-British Storm Shadow cruise missiles with American components. As much as this is another positive impact of the Kursk operation that crossed too many Russian red lines at this point, Ukraine has to be careful with the choice of targets, since a big fraction of missiles have already been used and the number of remaining ones remains in low double digits. Around November 18th, the controversial reports about Plekhovo surface, which indicates that the Russians at least increased their activity around the town with unknown results. Most likely, the situation here mimics the one around Novoivanovka, which is for a long time is not fully controlled by Ukrainian troops, but belongs more to the grey zone, since Ukrainians sometimes launch attacks inside the village to clash with adversary. By November 20th, Ukrainians retreat from the salient south of Kremennoye, likely to prevent the possible encirclement. It was 3 kilometers in narrowest point, so getting in and out of positions there was extremely dangerous, under drone-controlled skies. With hindsight, it's important to mention that once any corridor becomes too narrow, the FPV drones are capable of literally patrolling it 24/7, completely cutting out any logistics. This in turn makes holding positions impossible, and essentially is a modern way to isolate parts of the battlefield without having a single soldier behind enemy lines. Ukraine, meanwhile, also conducts its first strike with Storm Shadow missiles, as well as regular HIMARS GMLRS rockets on the Russian command post. It was hidden in the bunker near the village of Mar'yino, so the use of Storm Shadows, which also have bunker-busting properties, was extremely relevant. In this strike, directed by drones of the 78th Air Assault Regiment and 413th UAV Battalion, 18 officers are killed, and 33 are wounded, including 3 North Koreans, and likely Lieutenant General Valery Solochuk, deputy commander of the Leningrad military district. This is the first, but not last, attack which aims to cripple Russian chains of command to disrupt the continuing brutal assaults in Kursk region. On November 25th, Ukrainians also destroy 92 N6E radar station and 2 launchers of the Russian state-of-art S-400 air defense missile system with 3 ATACMS missiles in the area of Bolshoye Zhirovo, not far from Kursk. Among killed are 2 crew members and 3 engineers that were servicing the system. On land, Russians somewhat intensify attacks on Ukrainian positions, on November 26th driving a large column of the 104th Guards Air Assault Regiment through Zelený Shlях. As usual, assault is poorly planned, because the head of the column is composed of thinly armed aluminum BMDs loaded with huge amount of ammunition and paratroopers. After hitting landmines on the road, these explode one after the other, without the slightest chance for troops inside. The T-72 that followed BMDs apparently hits a landmine and falls off the road, just to be soon finished by a FPV drone. The same fate awaits another tank of the same type, which for some reason was at the very end of the column. One of the BMDs, after seeing literal evaporation of 3 other vehicles in front, apparently decides to retreat, turning around and driving quite far away. But it hits a landmine too, likely also dropped from the drone and finished off by the FPV after being abandoned. Apparently, it was not loaded with too much ammo, which saved crews' lives, who yet were later killed by drone-dropped grenades. This assault also features 2 quite rare Russian Buran infantry mobility vehicles. Surprisingly, these proved much safer than BMDs, likely saving the crew's lives instead of incinerating them after both struck landmines. This once again highlights the advantage of MRAPs over traditional vehicles. Their combination of speed, light but still effective armor, and the absence of easily flammable munitions inside gives crews far greater chances of surviving drone strikes compared to traditional IFVs or APCs, especially Soviet models. As we have already seen, it's Ukraine, not Russia, that primarily operates MRAPs, and this advantage continues to save countless lives. Exactly MRAPs, which are also far easier to replace than the tanks or IFVs, make up the largest share of Ukraine's relatively high vehicle losses. While Russians continue their regular mechanized assaults with vehicle columns on the western flank of the salient, they also begin similar daily attacks against Ukrainian positions around Plekhovo. Here, 129th DDF Brigade and its drone company Ravens, which are not as famous as the 47th Mechanized or 95th Air Assault Brigades, does an excellent job in repelling attacks. The fields to the east of Plekhovo are littered with remains of 18 BTR-82s that were destroyed from November 12th to 30th. This forces Russians to switch to more common and costly tactic of small infantry groups, which have to walk towards positions through open fields under constant drone strikes. Throughout November, numerous reports surfaced about first engagements involving North Korean soldiers. If these accounts are accurate, it suggests that Russian forces were attempting to quietly integrate them into existing units, reportedly those from Buryatia and other eastern regions of Russia, where their presence could be more easily obscured. However, as the Kremlin grows increasingly desperate to drive Ukrainian forces out of the Kursk region, before the new year, efforts at concealment appear to be abandoned. In a significant escalation, 12,000 allegedly Kim Jong-un's most capable troops have now been deployed to Kursk in full force, no longer hidden and ready to confront Ukrainian troops head-on. On December 14th, the floodgates open. North Koreans attacked simultaneously in the area of Kruglenkoye, Pogrebki, Naidionov, and near recently captured Plekhovo, moving in large chaotic formations through the snowy fields towards Ukrainian positions. What is interesting is that Russians apparently did not provide their allies with any armored vehicles, nor teach them to move in small infantry groups. Therefore, quite predictably, North Korean troops employed tactics from their last war that ended in 1953, attacking in large human waves. Ukrainians immediately employ FPV drones, as well as probably the most appropriate weapons to counter such tactic, cluster munitions. Such 155mm shells, as well as cluster GMLRS rockets, quickly devastate North Korean ranks, while drones no longer have to search for targets, instead picking and choosing whom to take out on the open terrain. Even seeing how their allies sustain mass casualties, the Russians do little to assist them, as fields where they used to attack in mechanized columns are quite literally covered by hundreds of killed North Korean soldiers, a massacre not seen since the times of Battle of Bakhmut. Together with that, it would be unfair to say that the assaults were entirely without results. The PRK troops pushed Ukrainians from many positions on the northern flank of the salient, where Russians were unable to achieve any breakthroughs for months. In response, Ukrainians redeployed the 144th Infantry Brigade to the salient to let the 22nd Mechanized Brigade reinforce positions there, together with operatives of the elite 73rd Naval Center of Special Operations and Rangers. Elements of the 8th Special Operations Regiment, which are also seen across the salient, focus their efforts around Kruglenkoye, clashing with and killing dozens of North Koreans in quick attacks that leverage communication hurdles between Russians and their new allies. Meanwhile, Russian assaults also continue, in particular in the notorious area of Zelený Shlях on the western flank. There, the Russian 34th Motor Rifle Brigade and a few other regiments arrived to support VDV forces after their extremely costly but pointless assaults. By December 18th, using overall increased pressure on Ukrainians, Russians also make minor gains near Zelený Shlях and Plekhovo. The next day, they drive a wedge in Ukrainian positions in the northwestern part of the salient, as well as close on Martinovka. In an attempt to slow down the advance, Ukrainians intensify strikes on Russian command posts, destroying one in Rilsk on December 20th. On December 21st, Ukrainians continue to lose positions near Plekhovo as Russians take a foothold in Kirillovka. At the same time, attempts to cross the border here are stopped. By that time, Russians apparently decide to change the way they use North Koreans, because a week of human wave assaults annihilated a big fraction of the whole force. Thus, from now on, the PRK units, which apparently were deployed and acted as 4 separate brigades, are slowly withdrawn, atomized, and placed under the command of the Russian units. This way, they are still used as purely expendable troops and continue to take heavy losses, but at least the media effect from hundreds of eliminated North Koreans in open fields is mitigated. Noted PRK soldiers were also taken as prisoners despite Ukrainian forces entering close-quarter combat with them, which is pretty easy to explain. Language barrier as well as ideological training, thanks to which North Koreans allegedly believe that they are fighting American and South Korean troops in Kursk, make surrender among the PRK troops almost impossible. Evidence shows that they would much more readily take their own life with a hand grenade in any desperate situation. On December 23rd, Ukrainians reinforced the Zelený Shlях area with a battalion of 116th TTF Brigade, likely to free up forces to mitigate a dangerous wedge to the north. However, by December 22nd, Russians, mostly using Koreans for one-way assaults, further expanded. On December 25th, Ukrainians answered by destroying the command post of what was left of the Russian 810th Marine Brigade in Lvov with GMLRS rockets. These strikes killed the deputy commander of the brigade, Salim Pashtov, as well as other officers of the unit. By December 30th, Ukrainians slightly improved their positions in Kruglinkoye, where Russians had earlier created a small wedge towards Malaya Loknya. By the next day, the wedge is fully liquidated as Ukrainian 8th Special Operations and 6th Ranger Regiments launched multiple conversion assaults, taking out most of the North Korean troops holding it, with the help of drones. On the eastern flank of the salient, both Russians and Ukrainians have certain success assaulting positions of each other as elements of the Ukrainian 67th Mechanized Brigade arrive here. The year ends with Ukrainians more or less stabilizing the situation in Kursk region after quite chaotic and bloody battles, with a mix of Russian and North Korean troops in the second half of December. The strike with Storm Shadow missiles in Lvov on this day also kills 8 and wounds 22 officers of BDV, among whom a chief of division communications Valery Tereshchenko, commander of the engineering battalion Pavel Maletsky from the 76th Division, and deputy chief of staff Oleg Surov from the 104th Division. On January 2nd, the command post of the 810th Marine Brigade is attacked, this time in Ivanovskoye, right during the ceremony where Russian officers were receiving awards. Even though the brigade is less active due to heavy losses, its command was likely playing a big role in the overall planning of grouping operations. The next day, the Russians advanced back to recently lost positions near Sudzha. They also continuously tried to establish pontoon bridges for their VDV forces in Daryino area, as their focus shifts to attempts to create an encirclement out of the Ukrainian salient by advancing into Sumy region. Meanwhile, Ukrainians are also eager to attack after repelling hundreds, if not thousands, of Russian assaults in the course of the last 4 months. Having limited reserves and a much more lower tolerance for losses, they prepare for counterattack much more rigorously than the Russians. Ukrainian command chooses to acquire the prioritized part of the front line, attacking from the southern part of Cherkasskoye-Porechnoye, while avoiding mined roads. The first ones to go are Bergepanzer II engineering vehicles with mine blows that create a corridor for the rest of the attack force. All armor, tanks, strikers, and MRAPs are covered in cages with elastic nets, as well as have a new jamming equipment. Thus, no vehicles are lost to mines, and radio-controlled FPV drones of the Akhmat regiment mostly fall to the ground upon approaching the column. Fiber optic FPVs still score hits, destroying 3 strikers, M577 and a few MRAPs, according to the footage, but this is about all Russians can do. The column arrives at the village of Berdin, allowing the infantry to disembark and enter brutal combat with Russian infantry. Overall, Ukrainians have managed to advance 2.5 kilometers forward with minimal losses in a drone-dominated environment, showing that with proper reconnaissance and equipment, it's still possible to conduct limited attacks. Berdin, however, remains in Russian hands as Ukrainians retreat from it after brutal close-quarters combat, taking positions in nearby tree lines. Eventually, by January 6th, Russians in a number of costly assaults recapture most of the positions Ukrainians took here, even though certain buffer zone east of Cherkasskoye-Porechnoye remains in Ukrainian hands. As we mentioned fiber optic FPVs, it's also a good time to talk about their effectiveness. First of all, their ability to bypass jamming and fly long distances is certainly a remarkable leap forward. Ukrainians play catch-up here already using their own kind of such drones developed by specialists of the Birds of Magyar unit, but more time for mass production is needed. Together with all the advantages, fiber optic drones are also slower, and their warheads tend to be slightly smaller due to necessity to carry extra spools of fiber optic itself. Despite the large amount of footage published by Russians, they tend not to show the aftermath of the strikes from the second drone, which hints that not every hit is successful. It's especially relevant for vehicles such as Leopard 2s, Challengers and Bradleys, which by no means are invincible, but can survive dozens of hits from radio and fiber optic FPVs, especially if equipped with nets and jammers. A good example of this is not only the video of Bradley surviving the hits during missions we covered earlier, but also the following footage. Here we can clearly see an immobilized and abandoned Bradley IFV, which is hit by Russian fiber optic FPV drone from the side. The drone operator misidentifies Bradley as Marder in video captions and also aims not at the side armor itself, but the block of Brad reactive armor shielding it. The first drone either loses connection or deals no damage, though the Russians send another one. The second FPV detonates, likely hitting armor at a better angle, but what the third drone actually shows is that only one segment of reactive armor was destroyed while the Bradley hull remains intact. For some reason, Russians claim a kill here, even though it's not, but to be fair, with such activity of drones, it's unlikely the vehicle was evacuated. Nevertheless, what this footage shows is that the era of armored vehicles and tanks is not over. It's rather the era of poorly designed armored vehicles and tanks, which had slight chances before, is actually over. Russians also continue their attacks, suffering heavy losses in exchange for small land gains. Their planning relies so much on numerical superiority and nothing else that sometimes simply unthinkable scenarios happen. For example, while Ukrainians were storming Berlin, to the west of Russo-Ukrainian, either Russians or North Koreans launched their attack, as a result of which a few infantrymen ended up stranded in the open field. The striker IFV of the 80th Air Assault Brigade, likely being out of ammunition, quite literally circles around them, trying to run over the adversary infantry. At least 2 soldiers are taken out this way, once again demonstrating how little support one-way Russian assaults can have. On January 7th, Russians enter Makhnovka to the south of Sudzha. We rarely visit this front line here, as Russians rely on the same tactic, making only slight progress here and there. But this progress accumulated over months means that they got closer and closer to Ukrainian supply lines that go through Sudzha. Ukrainian command also understands that, redeploying here the 33rd Assault Regiment, which expanded from the battalion that took part in the initial breakthrough in August 2024. Similar situation happens near Daryino. Russians constantly attack with various VDV regiments, usually taking heavy casualties, but infiltrating behind the river in this area. By January 8th, Russians also dangerously approach Malaya Loknya, so the 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade conducts a number of assaults in Syrskyi, which is mostly in the grey zone. Overall, constant assaults of North Koreans and Russians in this area start without less losses and more gains, possibly due to exhaustion of Ukrainian brigades holding it. Even though Ukraine concentrated here both well-equipped and motivated troops, recently reinforced with at least 1 battalion of the 92nd Assault Brigade, they were under constant pressure for the last 3 months, also losing men and equipment due to the high activity of drones. For example, if we take 47th Mechanized Brigade, mostly equipped with American armored vehicles and tanks, it lost 3 M1 Abrams tanks throughout this period, which may seem insignificant as the Russians can easily lose as many tanks in a single mechanized assault. However, note that brigades operates only 30 tanks of this kind, all that US has managed to provide, and has already lost 15 M1 tanks before the Kursk Incursion. So, its total tank losses are 60% of the total strengths. Together with that, being the main user of M2 Bradleys, the brigade lost 20 of these IFVs for the same time period. The losses of the other units, mostly using Soviet equipment, are likely higher, not just in vehicles but also in men, because almost all Bradleys and Abrams tanks were successfully abandoned by crews after critical damage, which is often not the case for T-64 tanks or BMPs. On January 10th, Russians also tried to infiltrate through the Ukrainian border to the west of the salient. First, the BTS-4 armored engineering vehicles tried to destroy the anti-tank ditch, but it's quickly burned down by drones. Then, Russians for some reason bring the single up-armored MTLB to the area, which is also destroyed by drones. So, despite how dangerous 2 conversion strikes through the border can be for Ukrainian grouping, the Russian command still heavily prioritizes head-on assaults in the northern part of the salient, which mostly end with high losses and allow Ukrainians to retreat quite safely in case of possible encirclement. Something like that happens when Russians and North Koreans conduct heavy assaults of Russo-Ukrainian with moderate success. Russian aviation, which just a few months ago was actively dropping hundreds of OMPK glide bombs on the Ukrainian positions, is also forced to decrease the number of sorties due to bad weather, which results in significant icing on aircraft. On January 11th, the first North Korean soldiers are taken as prisoners by servicemen of the 95th Air Assault Brigade, as well as 8th Regiment of Special Operations Forces, after being wounded and apparently unable to resist. In contrast, Russians sometimes surrender by dozens in the Kursk region. It's usually linked to the insane orders they continue to receive, especially after breaking another deadline for pushing Ukrainians out of Kursk region completely. In January, the first North Korean heavy weapons also started appearing in the Kursk region. These are Bullseye 4 ATGM system, M1978 Koksan howitzers, and even a localized version of the Soviet Tor air defense system. This further highlights the slowly approaching shortages of equipment in the Russian army, as well as deepening cooperation between the countries. Sometimes, however, cooperation has unintended consequences, as the only seen North Korean Tor was actually destroyed by Russian FPV drone crew in the Kursk region and later labeled as Western-made radar in the disposal of Ukrainians. By January 16th, Russians continue assaults, once again trying to cross the border to the west of the salient. This time they bring 4 BMP-2s and 1 BMD, but the assault is again quickly curbed by FPVs. The Russian infantry eventually is forced to retreat without much territorial gains in the Sumy region. These repeated border attacks might serve diversionary purposes, but since they are thwarted mostly by a handful of drones, Ukrainians do not really redeploy any reserves here. Overall, January is characterized by a slowdown in Russian advances. Massive columns become less common in the Kursk region, while near Pokrovsk, Russians' seemingly unstoppable territorial gains also stall, likely since strategic reserves prepared for further assaults on the key Donbas city are tied down in the north. It does not mean, however, that massive assaults do not happen at all. On January 19th, Russians use slightly modified tactics, splitting their armor into 3 groups that apparently have different destinations. One group of 3 BMP-3s has to disembark infantry near the tree line south of Malaya Loknya. Upon arrival, however, armored vehicles face drones of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which in a matter of minutes cause catastrophic explosions in each vehicle. This happens because BMP-3, which is meant to rival Bradley, has extremely weak armor on its sides, and in most cases is filled with 100mm shells for its main gun, which is supposed to be a key advantage. However, it so drastically reduces crew survivability that most of the vehicles are enveloped in flames long before they can even make first shots. The next group is likely stopped with landmines and artillery, so the Russian infantry has time to retreat. Quite soon, their 2 BMP-3s are finished off by drones, same as the T-80 BVM that was lagging behind, even though it survived a few hits from FPVs before, and likely was supposed to be on the spearhead of the attack. 2 BMP-3s reach Nikorsky just to face more drones that once again cause catastrophic detonations, with no survivors in each vehicle. This way, yet another Russian mechanized assault ends without any territorial gains. Meanwhile, Ukrainians with forces of the newly arrived 33rd Assault Regiment pushed Russians back in Makhnovka, improving their positions. On January 20th, despite multiple thwarted assaults, Ukrainian troops remain mostly on positions along Malaya Loknya River. This mimics the situation in other parts of the western flank of the salient, where the Snagost River also plays an important role in how the Ukrainian defense in a situation of sharp deficit of men is structured. Trying to regain positions next to the river near Sudzha, Ukrainians also advanced in the area of Makhnovka by January 24th. On January 28th, 225th Assault Battalion is expanded into regiment. Inside the salient, the Ukrainian command also redeploys the 210th Assault Regiment Berlingo. Together with the 33rd Assault Regiment, also recently expanded, these form something unofficially called Syrskyi's Assault Guard. All because the idea to form smaller than brigades and highly specialized assault units belonged to the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Alexander Syrskyi. The beginning of the Kursk Offensive was a proof of concept, since 225th and 33rd Assault Battalions were capable of deploying quickly and covertly, and at the same time attack exactly where Syrskyi needed. Larger brigades, with their own staff and degree of autonomy, received more general orders to hold and advance into the area, but surgical strikes had to be executed by smaller units. Exactly for such strikes, Syrskyi, who often resorts to micromanagement of critical parts of the front line, grew his assault guard. He is often criticized for that, since his predecessor, Valery Zaluzhny, intervened way less into the work of subordinates, and gave a wide degree of autonomy. However, it's important to remember that Syrskyi and Zaluzhny operated in completely different situations, and thus faced different challenges. Syrskyi in particular inherited an army with serious manpower shortages, and a very problematic life cycle of new brigade formation. So, as long as assault regiments under the direct command of the commander-in-chief are capable of performing tasks and inflict disproportionate losses on the adversary, it's hard to criticize them. Once again reinforcing the importance of terrain, by the end of the month, the Russians are able to advance mostly in the area between the rivers of Snagost and Mala Loknya, after a number of brutal assaults. Now, as surprising as it is, half of the year has passed since the beginning of Ukrainian Kursk incursion. Throughout December and January, the greatest single change was the involvement of North Korean troops in direct combat. What's interesting is that over the last few weeks of January, these were mostly withdrawn from Kursk front line. The single believable reason for that is mass casualties, which wore down the 12,000-man strong grouping to the point of combat ineffectiveness. As we mentioned, the first human wave attacks of North Korean troops were disastrous for them, but the situation likely did not improve once these were atomized and subordinated to regular Russian army units. With little regard to the lives of fellow soldiers, which were demonstrated by continuous suicidal assaults, Russian commanders had even less concern for their new allies and simply annihilated them against Ukrainian defenses, which returned the situation to the status quo by the end of January. It is clear that soldiers Kim Jong-un sent have little in common with true special operations forces, but they were still mostly young and motivated men with prior service experience. To use them effectively, Russians only needed to teach their new allies how to fight in battlefield dominated by drones, how to move in small groups, employ FPVs for strikes, and operate reconnaissance UAVs. Yet, despite at least a month on Russian training grounds, their first attacks showed quite clearly that the training was never provided. And the results were predictable, with approximately a quarter of grouping being killed and wounded in the second half of December. However, DPRK troops were learning, and later footage shows them operating FPVs and reconnaissance drones in a proper manner, as well as testing some of their own gear, such as Bullseye 480GM system. Even though it happened only after heavy losses, the introduction of North Koreans and their adaptation still allowed Russians to withdraw depleted Marine brigades and other units, while further increasing pressure on Ukrainians. This in turn led to further territorial gains. In addition, the lessons that survivors of the Kursk carry home may one day reshape the way North Korea fight wars far beyond Ukraine. As of the end of January, the Ukrainian held salient into Kursk shrank roughly to 400 square kilometers, after being over 1,000 square kilometers at its peak. Despite continuous pressure, Russia did not manage to achieve at least local rapid breakthroughs, as in the first counterattacks against the salient, mostly due to Ukrainians doing solid work with fortifications and mining, as well as keeping the pressure high with drones. What's interesting is that Russians continued to supply their grouping of forces north with the best equipment they could get in a situation of not just looming, but quite real armor shortages. When we were discussing the assaults where the Russians lost 7 BMP-3s almost simultaneously due to drones and landmines, on the other parts of the front line they were seen driving into head-on assaults, literally on civilian cars. This clearly shows that Kursk is prioritized the same as Pokrovsk, if not more. The advance there, by the way, significantly slowed down, and this is what we are referring to as a strategic effect of the Kursk Offensive. There was quite significant time lag, and the halt is not complete, but the situation for Ukrainians there looks much better than in the summer or fall 2024. One of the speculations, which we see as plausible, is that one of the goals of the Kursk incursion was to ultimately exchange the captured land for something, or at least use it as a leverage during negotiations. Yet, since early 2025, it has become evident that peace talks pushed by the new US administration are a true zero-sum game for Ukraine and Russia. Kursk carried the potential to be card for both Ukrainians and Americans in discussions with Russia, but the White House's decision to avoid pressure in Moscow stripped it of any value. In the end, such zero-sum game left both sides holding just zero, so the battle shall continue. On February 6th, exactly 1 month after the previous tactical counterattack, Ukrainians launched another mechanized assault to regain lost positions in the Kursk region. This time, the mechanized column departs from Kolmakov, bypassing Cherkasskaya Konopelka with the goal of dropping infantry in Fanaseyevka. Overnight, before the assault, Ukrainian engineering equipment was actively clearing the gray zone area from landmines and even established a mechanized bridge on the key route inside the village of Kolmakov, Apparently, the Ukrainian command also slightly corrected the approach since the last counterattack that was quickly mitigated and now uses significantly more vehicles. However, once again, the emphasis in attack was made on proper use of cages, jamming and engineering equipment. Ukrainian Bergepanzer II and Vincent I MC vehicles, with the support of tanks, make paths, form ramps and IFVs in the field, bypassing a few Russian positions there and avoiding mine draws. Russian radio-controlled FPVs are either all jammed or are not used at all, while fiber optic FPVs inflict modest losses, destroying a few MRAPs and one Ukrainian T-64 hit 3 times before being abandoned by its crew. Despite that, the group of MRAPs with Ukrainian air assault forces spearhead into Fanasievka along the road, bypassing reinforced positions in Cherkasskaya Konopelka. After the infantry takes a foothold in the village, enemy counterattacks are repelled, unlike months ago in Verdun, where Russian infantry prevailed. Overall, the operation, while being risky, drives a significant patch south of Sudzha, but does not really change things strategically, remaining another purely tactical counterattack. It's important to note that because every such counterattack of Ukrainian forces is usually labeled by many war observers as a new major counteroffensive, when it reaches its tactical goals, it's immediately recognized as a failure. Yet, such advances provide a temporary relief for forces, allowed to cover up troop rotations, for example reinforcements for the 61st Mechanized Brigade, and raise morale. Still, strategically, Ukrainian positions remain weakened here, with defense mostly anchored on 33rd Assault Regiment. After all, Russians are already using fiber optic FPVs inside Sudzha due to past advances towards the city, degrading Ukrainian logistics daily. Drones also actively target Ukrainian artillery, inflicting heavy losses on it. Fortunately for Ukrainians, steady stream of domestically produced Bogdana self-propelled howitzers covers up these losses. On the western flank, the 155th Marine Brigade comes back to the front line after a few months of recovery due to being virtually destroyed, along with 810th Marine Brigade. North Koreans also return after a certain break, as Russians use what was left of them mostly in the northwestern part of the salient. The newly arrived Chimera drone unit provides Ukrainian troops with enough support to repel most of the attacks there. At the same time, the overall picture increasingly shows a gradual withdrawal of forces from the Kursk region. Apart from 501st Marine Battalion, it's difficult to identify all specific units involved in gradual retreat, but under relentless drone pressure and political constraints, Alexander Syrskyi has no illusions that the operation is nearing its end. Thus, his attention also shifts towards Pokrovsk, where the Ukrainians not only managed to halt Russian advances, but even execute several sharp counterattacks, using elements of Syrskyi's assault regiments not engaged in fighting around Kursk. This in turn places the fate of the ongoing battles in the north into the hands of Brigadier General Alexei Shandar. As a deputy commander of the air assault forces, Shandar has participated in the planning of the Kursk Offensive, though he remained overshadowed by Syrskyi. The commander-in-chief directly controlled nearly every unit in the area, with the close assistance of the Chief of General Staff, Anatoly Bargilevich, and a regiment that had made both the rapid initial advance and the subsequent strong defense possible. The fortifications built around small Kursk villages and along the border were organized primarily by Major General Dmytro Krasilnikov, who assumed command of the Operational Command North after Shandar was promoted to lead the operational tactical grouping of forces Siversk, fighting in Kursk region. By February 9th, Ukrainians regained control over several positions on the western bank of the Malaya Lokhnya River. At the same time, Russians, having finally established reliable crossing over the Snagost River after a month of fighting, advanced towards Severdikovo. It quickly becomes clear that their success is not due to sheer luck, but the result of redeploying a significant portion of their grouping to this sector. This shift also explains the sudden Ukrainian gains near Malaya Lokhnya, which had long been the focal point of the Russian efforts. Now, the focus clearly moves to Sverdlikovo. On February 10th, Russians further drive a wedge in Ukrainian positions there, forcing Ukrainians to respond by redeploying the elite Timura Special Unit of Defense Intelligence. This allows to slow down the advance, but heavy combat right in the key village continues as of February 13th. Worth mentioning that losses of previous months of mechanized assaults significantly affected the Russian equipment stockpiles. Now, they switched to small infantry groups, as reserves of armored vehicles perished during the fall campaign. The exceptions, however, also happen. On February 16th, the 155th Marine Brigade launches the largest assault in months, attacking Ukrainian positions in Nikolsky with a mechanized column. This time, Russians actually arranged vehicles in proper order, as the column is headed by the T-80 BVM with additional armor, mine plow, and a bright Soviet flag on top. 4 BTRs closely follow the tank, this way avoiding landmines. While still moving through the grey zone, the column is attacked by artillery and FPVs of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, and due to lack of jamming, 1 BTR-82 is immobilized. The Russian troops inside disembark and start running across the flat field towards Ukrainian positions. Soon, another BTR is taken out this way, once again forcing the infantry to attack by foot. Same fate awaits another BTR that closely follows the tank. The Russian T-80 BVM, being the most armored vehicle out of all, almost reaches Syrskyi, detonating a number of mines, but after multiple FPV hits, finally comes to a halt. One of the surviving crew members leaves the tank, likely wounded, but another FPV drone ends his suffering. Ukrainians also execute a few extra strikes on the tank to make sure it's completely destroyed, and switch back to one lucky BTR that started retreating after the first losses were taken by the column. Soon, it's located by FPVs and also burned down. As much as this assault is typical for Russians, there are a few small observations that are worth mentioning. First of all, the return of North Koreans was likely the reason why the Soviet flag was used. As Russians, unlike Ukrainians, do not use any digital battlefield system, they have to rely on visual symbols to differentiate between friend and foe. Before, these were large ZV and O letters. However, the only easy symbol that both they and North Koreans know well is Soviet flag, thus the decision to use it on the first vehicle on the column. Judging from the astonishingly terrible operational planning, which yet is not surprising after all that we saw in this series, we can conclude that the command of the 155th Marine Brigade is simply unable to learn from their mistakes. Replenished with men and vehicles after disastrous defeats, they repeat assaults in the exact same way that inflicts maximum casualties. Even the fact that Sergei Yefremov, vice governor of the Russia's Primorsky Krai region and commander of the Tiger Battalion of the brigade, was killed on February 2nd, did not force them to rethink their approach. Unlike near Malaya Loknya, around Sverdlikovo, Russian VDV forces continue methodically expanding the wedge, reaching the border here by February 20th. The attempts to cross it, however, are stopped by timely redeployment of the 78th Air Assault Regiment. By February 22nd, Russians also push Ukrainians out of recently captured Fanaseyevka. Since the capture of Sverdlikovo separated a small part of the salient to the west of Sudzha, by February 24th, Ukrainians start a slow retreat to the border there, despite concentrating Marines as well as Rangers to mitigate further advances. The defense here crumbles as Russians also intensify assaults in the northern part as well as in the area of Kurilovka. That way, by February 25th, Ukrainians further lose Pogrebki and most importantly, positions around Sverdlikovo. By the end of the month, they retreat to the border in a separated portion of the salient, that is way more reinforced and easy to defend. Full withdrawal of the 21st Mechanized and 3 more brigades was another reason for that. Overall, Russian successes are explained by the fact that they suddenly shifted focus to a less reinforced part of the front line, namely Sverdlikovo, instead of burning hundreds of vehicles in assaults near Malaya Loknya, and started actively targeting Ukrainian logistics. The latter becomes relevant only when the Russians' extremely bloody assaults allowed to reduce widths of the salient to approximately 20 kilometers, which means that any logistical vehicles in it can reliably be destroyed with regular FPVs. This is why positions to the north crumbled too, as Ukrainian troops in Malaya Loknya are most supplied and rotated out of combat through the single key road that is currently under constant drone surveillance and strikes. We already mentioned similar issues with Sudzha, but there, Ukrainians at least have urban buildings to hide vehicles, while the western part of the salient consists mostly of villages completely leveled down by aviation. On March 2nd, Russians continue to pressure Ukrainian western flank, as every new kilometer of advance exposes more and more already vulnerable supply lines to constant drone strikes. It's also worth mentioning that Russians gradually accumulated all their best FPV drone teams, such as Hateful Eight, Sudoplatov's battalion, Kaskad, Bobar and Rubicon here, withdrawing them from the other parts of the front line. If in 2024 strikes on Ukrainian logistics in Kursk were irregular, most of the key roads were simply out of drone reach, now the situation has drastically changed. Since the end of January, Russian multi-frequency and fiber optic FPVs, as well as various winged strike drones, make constant ambushes on supply vehicles and effectively control all the roads in Kursk and partially Sumy regions. Essentially, Ukrainians now use the only supply line through Sudzha, which Russians quickly turn into the road of death for logistical vehicles. Ukrainians try to mimic the Russian anti-drone measures by turning key supply routes into corridors protected by nets, but it's quite late. The mud that comes together with warmer weather only makes the situation worse. By March 5th, Russians also crossed the Psel River in the area of Kurilovka, further continuing efforts to encircle the Ukrainian grouping with paralyzed logistics. Worth mentioning that all these events coincide with the US administration blocking deliveries of already ordered aid to Ukraine to pressure it into negotiations. So, around this time, the Ukrainian command likely makes a final decision to completely retreat from the Kursk region. Such an operation, in given circumstances, is one of the most fundamental challenges for the Ukrainian command, and personally Alexander Syrskyi, the author of the Kursk Incursion. After stabilizing Pokrovsk, he again has to jump to micromanage the area after fairly disastrous months for Ukrainians there. The last such retreat was executed near Avdiivka, where it was necessary to redeploy the whole 3rd Assault Brigade to the crumbling flanks to hold them. Now, the situation is less critical than there, but the Russian command already has a plan to make it such. Once again, mimicking what happened in Avdiivka a year ago, Russians decide to use underground pipe to infiltrate behind Ukrainian lines. This time, instead of sewer, they use the pipes used to transport natural gas. The mission, named Operation Pipe or Stream, however, is set up for failure from the very beginning. First of all, Russian volunteers in the Kursk region started looking for diving equipment and oxygen cylinders before the operation started, which was noticed by Ukrainian command. Sections of the pipe are also apparently filled with various condensates and tar, which makes breathing in them highly dangerous. Nevertheless, the Russian command, expecting to repeat the limited success of such operation in Avdiivka, sent over 100 men through the pipe in the first wave towards Ukrainian positions 15 kilometers away. The underground assault force is made from soldiers of the 30th Motor Rifle Regiment, 11th Sayre Assault, Veterаны and Vostok brigades, as well as Akhmat Special Forces Regiment. On March 8th, the first Russians crawl out of the pipe to the north of Sudzha, expecting that they are already behind Ukrainian lines. However, they find no Ukrainians who left this area earlier. Suddenly, they are hit by heavy artillery fire. Under a combination of regular and cluster artillery shells, troops cannot advance into Sudzha and retreat to the abandoned village of Kubatkin. Out of 800 men in total, not all of them survive though, as many choke to death or simply receive heavy poisoning with pipe tar. Judging from the videos, only a few soldiers have protective equipment, so it's not a surprise that in few months the reports will surface that operation survivors are usually not making it out in hospitals. Approximately a company of pipe infiltrators were also wiped out by artillery. The dangerous advance towards the border from Kurilovka further signals that Ukrainian forces are retreating in the area south of Sudzha. Yet, the rear guard formed from the elements of the 33rd and 225th Assault Regiments, along with 253rd Assault Battalion, inflict heavy losses on North Korean units there, halting their push towards the border. Similarly, Russian attempts to advance in the area of Zhuravka also fail. Yet, the border there is crossed, which clearly shows that Russians desperately try to encircle what was left of the garrison. Despite mounting pressure on the flanks, strained logistics, and infiltration through pipe, the Ukrainian withdrawal continues as planned. It's worth emphasizing, however, that relentless Russian drone pressure remains the primary challenge and complicating factor throughout the process. At the same time, Operation Pipe simply cannot have any meaningful impact as there is no footage of Ukrainian troops even engaging Russian infiltrators. Thus, the positions there were likely abandoned long time ago as troops focus on holding Sudzha. In public perception, however, the Russian narrative once again reversed the importance of pipe assault and drone pressure, turning a clearly suicidal mission into a tale of heroism. Meanwhile, Russians reclaim many positions in the northern part of the salient, which are already abandoned for some time. Since the roads remain extremely dangerous, most of the Ukrainian armored vehicles were evacuated earlier, while troops in many places have to retreat on foot. These, unlike assaults on foot, in some cases might be even safer, especially as Ukrainian infantry tries to move at night and along the forests and tree lines. At this point, the vehicles that try to cross the border are burned down in minutes, day or night. But what footage does not show is any major engagements, meaning Ukrainian retreat proceeds as planned. By March 10th, most of the grouping is evacuated and takes new positions in the Sumy region, while Russians continue to advance through abandoned settlements. The claims of the Russian command and Putin himself about thousands of captured Ukrainian soldiers, as usual, are not backed up by any evidence, as Russians can hardly demonstrate even a dozen of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Eventually, by March 16th, they recapture Sudzha and take a solid foothold behind the border in the area of Novenke, while also facing resistance near Guyevo. The river crossings there are actively bombarded by Ukrainian aviation, and vehicles are hit by drones, so they cannot quickly reclaim this land. Overall, by the end of the month, battles continue around Oleshny and Guyevo, which remain the last Ukrainian positions in place of initial salient. Various cross-border raids are also launched by both sides, with the goal of tying down the forces of each other. By the end of April, Russians mostly pushed their adversary from the last two villages held, declaring on April 26th that the whole area of the Kursk region is liberated. In reality, the Ukrainians continue to control positions along the border as well as attack in places like Demidovka. Russians also soon push into the Sumy region with their grouping. However, they reach only tactical gains, capturing a few destroyed border villages and stopping, just as in the course of their 2024 Kharkiv Offensive, about which we also made a separate video. So, at this point, we can draw final conclusions from the Kursk incursion and try answering the question of whether the operation was successful or not. First, let's start with the idea behind it and set of likely goals. As discussed earlier, the Ukrainian original grouping numbered at most about 15,000 men and struck in multiple directions. The distribution of forces makes it unlikely that there was a plan to seize deep Russian territory. Kursk, Lvov, or Kursk nuclear power plant. Claims that those were the true objectives lack supporting evidence. From everything we discussed, the most logical list of goals Alexander Syrskyi likely had in mind during planning is as follows. First, Ukrainian forces had to cross both Russian defensive lines, the border line and the main line about 15 kilometers inland, and secure key high grounds and towns such as Sudzha and Korenevo. The attack has to be shocking not only to Russian public and command, but also to Ukraine's allies. A dramatic operation would expose Russian weaknesses in defending its territory and its declared red lines. That in turn could push allies to increase support for Ukraine, above all by greenlighting the use of Western long-range missiles against targets on Russian soil. Second, a large number of surrendered Russian soldiers could be used in prisoner exchanges. That would put Russia under pressure to negotiate. In this scenario, Ukraine, riding the momentum of success, could present a set of demands together with all its allies, and in particular the incoming US administration, regardless of the election's outcome. Those demands would likely center on ceasefire and major land swap. Russians receive Kursk back in exchange for occupied parts of Ukraine. If Russians agree, Ukraine gets extra time to rework its problematic command and control structure, as well as give some rest to the armed forces and improve fortifications everywhere. If they decline, they will be blamed for sabotaging negotiations in front of the whole world, and will have to waste a huge number of resources and troops to first annihilate and then retake open land instead of advancing on Donbas. If we step away from speculations about political goals and return to the battlefield, the Kursk Offensive also had to serve another purpose. It was designed to force the Russians to move reserves from the east to the north. This would slow down their territorial gains and give Ukrainian troops temporary window to strengthen their fortifications and replenish their ranks in the region. At the same time, the offensive had to boost morale. After 2.5 years of fighting on Ukrainian soil, the war had finally been brought back into Russia. President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, also claimed that Ukrainian incursion was a preemptive strike against the Russian grouping that planned to advance on Sumy. However, the evidence in the form of the units we saw on the Russian border prior to the Ukrainian attack clearly indicates that this is not true. More plausible additional version, voiced by Zelensky, is that Russians also planned an advance on Zaporizhia, but cancelled it due to Kursk incursion. In any case, these were likely just formal justifications, and the real goals of operation likely aligned more with those listed above. Now, let's assess whether the goals were reached. Politically, the Kursk incursion was yet another major humiliation for Russia and proof that Ukraine is still capable of advancing. This notion effectively lifted restrictions on using most of the Western long-range missiles, as well as all other kinds of equipment on Russian soil. In the process of incursion, Ukrainians successfully used the element of surprise to advance fast and deep, especially compared with praised by many recent Russian successes in Donbas. After that, the attack force took a number of solid positions like Sudzha, but the failure to capture Korenevo was detrimental to the grouping in the long term. Exactly from Korenevo, Russians were launching the majority of their successful counterattacks and unblocked the land corridor to Glushkovo, which was also on the verge of collapse at some point. This misstep emerged mostly from the lack of forces in the very beginning, but this also could be attributed to the mistakes during the planning phase. Politically, the fact that Ukrainians controlled a large section of Russian territory was one of their strongest cards at the negotiating table. However, the United States' decision to begin peace talks with Russia semi-independently, rather than in full coordination with Ukraine and Europe, essentially threw that bargaining chip away. Ukrainians, however, had to face the repercussions of this decision, holding off under attacks with rapidly declining US military aid and eventually leaving the region. In terms of diversionary value, however, the Kursk operation had undeniable impact. Russia redeployed significant forces to the area. More than half of all its Marine and VDV formations took part in the bloody assaults there, instead of fighting in Donbas. This included 2 full VDV divisions, 2 VDV brigades, 2 Marine brigades and 1 more Marine regiment. They were supported by over 10 other brigades, as well as between 12 and 15,000 North Koreans, backed by more than a dozen separate motor rifle regiments, and Russia's most advanced drone units. All of this, equipped with the best available technology, from armored vehicles to cutting-edge fiber optic drones, was diverted specifically to Kursk. Against them, Ukrainians held out for 7 months with only about 10 mechanized brigades, 1.5 tank brigades, 3.5 air assault brigades, 4 separate assault regiments, roughly a dozen of territorial defense battalions, 1 Marine brigade and elements of the Special Operations Forces. If these units had been sent to Donbas, they would have been only a drop in the ocean amid massive groupings, and forced into costly attritional fighting. In Kursk, however, they for the first months created a maneuver battlefield, where Ukrainians consistently outperformed the Russians, yielding far greater value. Specifically, the beginning of the operation itself deserves a place in military strategy books. Ukrainians managed to covertly concentrate a small but sharp blitzkrieg force in the era of complete drone domination, something deemed impossible. Most importantly, they defeated and captured the bulk of the initial Russian grouping that held the border, an achievement often overlooked in the shadow of the eventual retreat. That retreat, however, was anything but a rout. It was carried out in an organized manner, as evidenced by the fact that Russians failed to achieve even a minor encirclement or capture more than a handful of Ukrainian troops. Instead, the same rugged Ukrainian grouping re-emerged in the Sumy region, where it inflicted staggering losses on the Russian forces. Despite throwing in immense manpower and equipment, the Russians not only failed to destroy the Ukrainian units, but also fell far short of their next objective, never coming close to threatening the city of Sumy, just 30 kilometers away from the border. The Kursk Offensive as a diversion did not completely halt the Russian advance in the southern part of the Donetsk region. However, in long term, it significantly slowed Russian gains, particularly around Pokrovsk, where Ukrainian forces even managed to launch several counterattacks, demonstrating that the city, whose fall had once seemed inevitable, was far from lost. Russian manpower losses during the Kursk incursion were staggering, due to the nature of their repeated frontal assaults, and especially when factoring in heavy casualties suffered by North Korean units. They were at least several times higher than Ukrainian ones. For over 6 months, Russians were on the constant, mostly poorly planned offensive, reclaiming what Ukraine captured in less than a month. Yet, Ukrainians paid for initial speed and eventual withdrawal with high vehicle losses, most of them inflicted by drones during resupply and rotations, not even assaults. In this video we already touched on fiber optic FPVs, and without diving deeper here, it's also worth underscoring the quality of Russian drone operators. The aforementioned Rubicon, formerly the Center of Advanced Unmanned Technologies Rubicon, is far more than a single drone unit. Well-financed and secretive, it links drone manufacturers, UAV training centers, and frontline drone detachments into a single efficient network. This systemic approach to drone warfare is arguably the most significant Russian military development of 2024. Since late February, Rubicon operators, thanks to the skills and cutting-edge equipment, have effectively annihilated the logistics of the Ukrainian Kursk grouping in less than a month, inflicting a large share of losses we will discuss further. Between August 6, 2024 and March 24, 2025, Ukrainians lost 790 pieces of equipment, according to the footage, while Russians 740 in the Kursk and Sumy regions. The ratio 1-to-1 in losses is considered unfavorable for Ukraine, which has both fewer vehicles in storage as well as lower capacity to produce them. However, this analysis is usually based on quite outdated data, and it's superficial. As of spring 2025, Russia mostly depleted its vast storage bases and uses way less equipment of all types than in the beginning of the war. So, since using less translates to losing less, it makes sense that Russian losses are roughly equal to Ukrainian. The composition is also important. For Ukrainians, 3 largest loss categories are infantry mobility vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, and tanks, 41, 34, and 9% respectively. For Russians, these are armored fighting vehicles, tanks, and transport vehicles, 58, 11 and 11% respectively. The infantry mobility vehicles correspond to only 9% of losses, compared to 41% losses for Ukrainians. All this shows us interesting dynamics that Ukrainians lost more in absolute numbers, but 41% of losses are basically armored tactical cars such as Humvees or MREVs such as Max Pros. Both types are quite easily replaceable, not only with Western aid that over the years provided literally thousands of them, but also by domestic production. Unlike tanks or IFVs, these do not require complex running gear, a fire control system, and gun with stabilization, which also makes them quite cheap. The real problem for Ukraine is that the third of losses were more rare and often Western IFVs such as Strikers, Bradleys, Marders, and CV-90s. However, in this specific category, Russians way surpassed their adversaries due to the absolutely atrocious assaults that filled the roads of Kursk region with hundreds of hulls of BTRs and BMPs. So, Ukrainian losses were high, but if we take into account their composition as well as the shift impact, and most importantly, the lives vehicles saved, when it comes to the cases of using Western tanks and IFVs, we can conclude that they are not nearly as catastrophic and do not significantly affect the Ukrainian capabilities in the long run. Further battles where Ukrainians continued to rely on mechanized assets only prove this. Russians at the same time used up mostly replaceable even in the long run vehicles out of carefully accumulated reserves likely prepared for the Pokrovsk direction. This is evident from the fact that while in Kursk and Pokrovsk, assaults were conducted with the new T-80s, T-90s and BMP-3s, in other directions, Russian troops were literally using motorbikes, scooters and civilian cars for head-on assaults. The Russian force that pushed into Sumy region in spring 2025 was almost exclusively infantry. Thus, we have to reiterate that without the Kursk incursion, the Russian command would be more rational with how they use remaining armored vehicles, but Kremlin orders likely gave Alexander Lapin, grouping commander, a full access to strategic vehicle reserves once the decision was made to eject Ukrainians from the region as soon as possible. All this resulted that Russians were forced to exchange their scarce IFVs for mostly adversaries replaceable IMVs at 1-to-1 ratio. It also applies to the bigger picture, as instead of fighting in Donbas, tens of thousands of Russians were forced to fight inside Russia for 7 months. Instead of dropping hundreds of OMPK glide bombs on Ukrainian settlements, these were dropped en masse on Russian ones, pretty much destroying all inhabited areas on the border. Instead of Ukrainian civilians losing homes, over 140,000 Russian civilians were displaced, with many losing everything they had and further putting a strain on already strained economy. And in the end, all Russians did in their campaign is pretty much restored control over ruins, gaining virtually nothing compared to August 2024. The aftermath of the operation, similar to other outcomes we mentioned, is also a topic of heated debates. Russians got a solid excuse to invade the Sumy region, but their grouping, after suffering staggering losses and immediately stripped off most of armor, quickly bogged down, especially since they failed to perform even the smallest tactical encirclement, allowing the Ukrainian grouping to conduct a successful retreat from the Kursk region. In Sumy, it's also harder to cut off Ukrainian logistics due to more forests, and Ukrainians no longer fighting in narrow salient. Their next goal was likely in line with the official one, creating a buffer zone. However, this goal leads only to further mass casualties, similar to the area north of Kharkiv. There, Russians were mostly proactive and attacked first in May 2024, just to hit a brick wall of Ukrainian defenses around 10 kilometers from the border, and failing to move even an inch forward beyond this barrier for over a year, continuing to suffer constant losses. In conclusion, the Ukrainian Kursk incursion was an ingenious operation by initial design, proving that Ukraine, against all the odds, can regain the initiative and advance, thanks to its commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrskyi. However, political circumstances beyond Ukraine's control, along with the limited forces available, significantly influenced how the operation unfolded. The Ukrainian retreat cannot be taken as a sole indicator of failure, since Ukraine never aimed to annex enemy territory, unlike Russia. Yet, heavy losses and the eventual collapse of logistics, which forced the withdrawal, suggest that concluding the operation earlier might have been a better course of action. These, of course, remain speculations, with the benefit of hindsight. In our assessment, the Kursk Offensive deserves to be called costly and modest, but still a success, a true case of squeezing water out of the rock, and the very first Blitzkrieg-style offensive of the drone era.